Ladies and gentlemen, today is May the 11th, 2025. We're here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How you doing?
Pretty good. Yourself?
Can't complain.
Would you like to, though?
Oh, not especially. I'm too well fed to really complain.
Ooh, do you have anything good?
Just a nice breakfast.
That's good. Mother's Day stuff, maybe?
Not really. I totally forgot today was Mother's Day.
Well, I'm glad you're doing well and reached an elegant sufficiency. We didn't have a session last week. I don't know how much of the stream that you saw, but we were doing a charity stream for the American Cancer Society.
Yeah, I saw some of that.
Yeah, we raised $1,217.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that was the number one streamer community for the event. I think it was six
nice.
grand total of what people raised. So it was a very, very fun format. And it's a format that we can technically do anytime we want, just independently. It's an app called Crowd Control, and it integrates people's ability to donate and then affect your video game. And Baldur's Gate just got integration for Crowd Control, but it's existed for other video games for quite some time. And it just became compatible with patch 8. So they lined that up with charity stream, and it was a hoot. Man, you know Onsur in Act 3, the lightning dragon?
Uh-huh.
You can insert coins and give the streamer a random legendary weapon. And at the portal where you pull out Gale in Act 1 at the very start of the game, someone gifted me a random legendary, and I got the Balduran Giant Slayer, the sword. And I was like, what? This is the best two-handed sword in the game. And then not 4 seconds later, someone casted Fireball on my whole party and wiped the whole honor run. So I had like extreme emotions in a very tight time frame. I'll find the clip for that, but it was a really funny time. The second run, they never actually wiped it, and I got into the Underdark in Act 2 and fought the Dwergar and stuff. So Chad was like kind of doing a tug of war of certain people were helping me and other people were hindering me, but it was a really good time and for a good cause, so that's a plus.
Well, I can see why so much money was spent.
Yeah, it's entertaining as hell. I'll send you the Twitch clip. You can watch on your own time.
Oh,
Someone
nice.
got it. Yeah, you really know who your friends and enemies are whenever you're seeing who's hindering you and who's helping you. Chat, you know who you are.
Well, all for a good cause, I suppose.
Yep. Yeah, but that was a blast. I haven't been super close with the news, but I heard there was a new pope. I heard that there's a new Air Force One. And that's about as far as I got.
Yeah, there was a proposal from, I think, the Emiratis. Or was it? No, it was the Qataris. They were offering to give the Trump administration a luxury jet so they could use it as Air Force One. Yeah, the kicker is that they set it up so that the administration would gift the plane at the end of Trump's term to his presidential library. So in other words, he would basically retain ownership even after he was president.
Wow.
So that had a lot of people screeching about corruption and emoluments and that kind of thing.
I would just kind of being skeptical of this. That seems corrupt, sure, but getting a plane from another country that isn't exactly a major ally, like, yeah, maybe we're allies, but don't you need it to be like the most secure airplane in the whole country? So you would want to build it nuts and bolts piece by piece yourself?
Yeah, that's been another big criticism. There's obviously some issues with security there.
Mm-hmm. They could easily bug it, I would think.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure they'll try. For the record, the U.S. does have fairly good relations with Qatar. We have a major naval base there. It actually has the headquarters for one of our fleets.
Huh. Didn't know that.
Yeah, they're not a treaty ally, but strategically we're fairly close.
A treaty ally would be one where there's like a mutual defense pact or something?
Correct.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the United States does not have any mutual defense treaties with any country in the Middle East that I'm aware of off the top of my head.
I would guess that deal would not go through. Who would need to approve of that?
Well, that is a good question. I think most presidents would just avoid the issue altogether, so it really hasn't come up before. So we don't have necessarily a whole lot of precedent. I suspect that if a president did accept such a gift, then it would fall to Congress to try to stop it. But of course, that brings into question whether or not the current sitting Congress would be willing to do that. Up till now, they've been fairly passive in the face of various provocative actions taken by the administration. So my suspicion is that probably the administration could just do it and then get away with it, regardless of legality.
Or safety. Or safety.
Yeah.
What would it have in it that makes it more of a luxury jet than Air Force One? Because isn't Air Force One a really nice airplane?
I mean, it's not bad, but it's not like oil chic nice, you know?
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, I imagine their luxury jets have rather more gold than Air Force One does.
Well, I know Trump likes gold, so.
Oh, does he ever?
I'm more of a silver guy myself. Like, for the aesthetic of a metal, the yellow goldish tone, I would take a platinum or a silver over that any day. But whatever. I'm not really much for expensive metals anyway.
I concur. I'm too poor for that kind of thing.
Yeah. But even if I did have money, I would get a fast car or something.
Oh, I would just buy more DLC for Stellaris. There's always more, it seems.
Is that what you've been gaming lately?
No. They just had a big update that completely reworked the economy.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, sort of. It's complicated, but unsurprisingly, there's a lot of bugs since they just released it. So I'm going to wait a couple weeks. Let them sort all of that out.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm definitely looking forward to it. It should be interesting.
Cool. Yeah, I've
been just doing random things lately. Picked up a couple demos off of Steam, been trying to work through those, learning how to play them, trying to see if they're worth the effort. And nothing especially consistent.
I got a promotion in Dota 2 recently.
Oh, nice.
Yep. It's been I would say a fun climb, but it depends on your team, how fun it is.
Yeah.
And then we have our 4-player honor mode run that we restarted with mods this time, and it's really fun. We have different races in play this time, so I'm a Cambion, and our friend Apoptosis is a Goblin, and then we have a half Giant on the team as well. So mix it up a little bit. The new subclasses are really fun. I picked the Jellyfish Swarm Ranger, and it's incredibly strong.
Is that right?
Yeah. I set the avatar for my Discord to be my character, and the first time I set it, there was a little blue dot next to my character's face, and Apop actually asked me to change it because it looked like he had a Discord notification, and it was distracting him. And I was like, yeah, it does kind of look like that. I'll change it. I don't want people to get too upset, being like, unread messages.
How's that run going?
It's really good. I think we're about ready to get to the Underdark because we got all the Goblin leaders, and then we actually took out Ethel before she was able to get down to her lair. If you stun or silence her, you can do so, and that saves you a lot of her legendary crap.
Nice.
Yeah, we do that on Monday nights.
What did you want to get to today?
Is there any global ramifications of a fancy new pope? How strong is the Catholic Church right now? Or is it a symbolic fun thing?
It's mostly a symbolic fun thing. I don't think anything of substance will really come out of the fact that he's American.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't think he's going to, like, wield a machine gun or anything.
No. Now, he might be less progressive than the previous pope, because Pope Francis was noted for being more of a liberation theology guy as far as his style of I don't want to say style of government, his style of poping, whatever the word would be. He was noted for being more progressive in his approach to the position of pope. So this guy might be less so. But people have been digging up his social media history, predictably so, and he has been somewhat critical of the Trump administration, if not Trumpism generally. So it's possible he could be relatively more progressive like the previous pope. But on the other hand, it's not necessarily surprising that, a member of the Catholic Church, a high-ranking priest in the Catholic Church might be critical of a government. They do that pretty much as a matter of course. So that may not betray any particular politics on his part. That just may be the Church's natural and inevitable position on things like immigration and whatnot. So I wouldn't read too much into that. So we'll see. The real answer is we'll see. We do not know yet just what he's going to do.
They looked up his social media posting. They looked up his browser history as well.
I'm sure he's deleted it.
Okay.
You've got to think. You got to think that's the wise course of action in that position.
That's cool.
I did appreciate all of the jokes about J.D. Vance killing the Pope. Very humorous.
What does that mean?
Well, the Pope died not long after he met with J.D. Vance. Vance was on a kind of world tour. He was visiting different leaders, and the Pope was one of them. And I think it was only like a week after their meeting that he passed. So, of course, the internet being the internet started making jokes about the Pope not being able to stand dealing with them and then just dying.
Man. I think Vance is Catholic, but he's not Roman Catholic. That's what people were saying. There's like an old Catholic or something variety where they don't...
I don't know about that. I didn't think there was any other type but Roman Catholic.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah, I hadn't heard anything. I'm sure somebody in chat would know better. If so, please let us know. He's definitely more of a conservative Catholic. He's actually a convert, if I remember correctly. He did not grow up Catholic, but he converted later. And he's part of kind of this sort of new school of traditionalist Catholics that have kind of cropped up over the past 5 years or so. So they didn't really like Pope Francis too much. Mm-hmm. They were not on the best of terms. They preferred more of an old school Catholicism. But I guess he didn't let that get in the way of his meeting with Pope Francis. I don't think it even came up, as far as I know. Let's see. I have stuff on just miscellaneous topics. So like Israel-Palestine, U.S. tariffs, Ukraine. I had some region-specific stuff. So I'm kind of wide open as far as what we want to get into. Also, over the past week or two, I've been Wikipedia diving. I've been doing some deep Wikipedia dives on Iran and Central Asia. So if you want to talk about that, just some general history stuff, that could be fun too if you want.
That sounds cool to me. Chat is asking about Netanyahu already.
Oh, Netanyahu.
Is Renaissance War Israel's preparing for the war of 7 fronts against Gaza?
War of 7 fronts? I'm not sure what that reference is.
I don't know.
Let's see. Yeah, Netanyahu is definitely kind of ramping up the conflict, but I don't know what's going to come of it or if that'll even be all that substantively different than what they were already doing. Yeah, we've got a little bit of a backlog on Israel, so we could run through that just to kind of get us up to date.
Sure.
Yeah, it has been a while. Israel in ceasefire. Yeah, that is a while ago. Let's see. They resumed the war in Gaza. Hamas, they say, rejected both Israeli and American proposals. That was sort of their casus belli there. Hamas retaliated, launching some rockets at Tel Aviv. No surprise. Let's see. So the ceasefire referred to here is the one that was negotiated at the end of, I want to say it was either the end of last year or very early this year. I don't quite remember exactly the time frame, but it was in place for several months. And then just kind of fell apart. There wasn't any traction on negotiating the next stage of the ceasefire, which hypothetically would have led to the Israeli military withdrawing from Gaza and more, if not all, hostages being released. Those talks didn't go anywhere, and eventually Israel decided to just end the ceasefire and resume hostilities, which is pretty much where we've been since then. Let's see. So in stuff not relating to Gaza, there actually were protests in Israel, partly over the resumption of the war in Gaza. A lot of people were very critical of that. There is still a widespread perception, especially on the left in Israel, that Netanyahu is dragging out the war for his own personal political benefit. So people kind of saw the resumption of the war as being part and parcel of that. But they were also protesting because the government is also trying once again to reform the judicial system. The reforms being pushed through, critics say, are going to undermine the independence of their judiciary. So we've talked at length about this particular topic before, but it hasn't come up in, 6 months, a year, thereabouts? It's kind of been out of the news cycle for a while since the October attacks back in 23. But the government has renewed that push, so unsurprisingly, opposition is pushing back. Let's see, they also, that is to say, the Netanyahu government also is trying, they may have already done this by now, trying to fire their attorney general, who they say has been not on the same page with the rest of the government. They say the attorney general has been resisting some of the reforms and changes they've been trying to implement. The attorney general has done so on legal grounds. He says the things they want to do are not legal. But of course, the government disagrees and they want to push him out. So that had a lot of people upset. The government also got in trouble. Well, I don't want to say get in trouble, but one of the unpopular things that contributed to the protests is that they wanted to fire the head of Shin Bet, which is the Israeli intelligence agency. It's basically their CIA, so to speak. Netanyahu was not on good terms with him because he was very critical of the way the war was being conducted. The head of the Shin Bet believed that there should have been more emphasis on getting the hostages rather than winning some kind of crushing victory against Hamas, which may or may not even be possible. Let's see, some specific things on the AG and the Shin Bet firing. For the Attorney General, the government accuses him of the following three things: failing to prosecute judicial reform protesters. This kind of goes back to earlier protests against judicial reform. There was a bunch of people that engaged in civil disobedience, which could be quite aggressive at times. The AG largely refused to prosecute them, even though he technically could have. The government didn't like that. Two, failing to investigate crime in Arab-Israeli communities. That's exactly what it sounds like. Number three, impeding the government's agenda, just sort of broadly speaking. For the Shin Bet guy, I don't have his name, so I apologize. Let's see. The Supreme Court actually did intercede to issue an injunction to prevent his firing. They haven't stopped it permanently. It is basically just frozen. And they were supposed to have a hearing no later than 8th of April. And I don't have an update on that, so I don't know what happened. if he did get fired, or maybe if he has been fired, it would be the first time in Israel's history that a government had fired the head of the Shin Bet. Never happened before. As far as impetus, Netanyahu said the week before that he intended to sack him, and specifically he cited a, quote, ongoing distrust between the two that had, quote, grown over time, end quote. And then the cabinet, for its part, stepped in and formally approved the dismissal, citing specifically the failure to anticipate the 7th October 2023 attacks. A lot of people I've read think that's just a fig leaf, though. There's apparently just some more interpersonal drama there. But that's the officially stated reason, anyway. Now, the Attorney General did fire back. Ronan Bar, there's his name. He issued a public letter saying that his firing was, quote, entirely tainted by conflicts of interest, end quote. And he also said late last month that he'd ordered the police and the Shin Bet to investigate officials within the administration over alleged financial ties to Qatar. So whether or not that's true or not, I don't know. That could just be him covering his ass, who's to say. But regardless, that is his defense, it seems, at this point. Oh, maybe it wasn't his name. I have it in my notes here. It was a Ronan Bar letter, but then I also have the Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara. So maybe Ronan Bar is the guy you sent the letter to. I don't know. It's been too long. But that's the gist of it. These are some of the reasons that mass protests broke out. Let's see. After that, there was a ceasefire proposal issued by Egypt and Jordan that was actually accepted by Hamas. Israel, as I recall, rejected it. The agreement, let's see, would have included the release of 5 Israeli hostages each week after the agreement was put in place. However, Hamas did say, they added a caveat here to their acceptance, that laying down its arms as Israel wanted to was basically a red line that they didn't want to cross. Let's see. And then starting around, mid-February to March, the Israeli military had launched around 70 ground incursions into southwestern Syria and had conducted at least 31 airstrikes on different targets in Syria. Supposedly, this is in defense of the Druze community. There's been intermittent fighting between jihadi groups and certain Druze communities. The exact reason why is a little ambiguous. As you might expect, there's not a lot of reporters on the ground in Syria.
Remind us who the Druze are again?
Sorry, what?
Remind us who the Druze are again?
Let's see. They're I don't want to say faction. Maybe a denomination would be the right word. They're a small fringe denomination of Islam that exists, I think, mostly, if not entirely, in the Levant.
Oh, yeah, they're the more mystical one, right?
One of them, yeah.
Gotcha,
One of the more mystical ones. Their founder, I think their founder is the one who thought he was God. Something like that. Some strange origin story of that variety. But they've not always been on good terms with more traditional iterations of the Islamic faith. And Israel has taken the opportunity here, given that there is a quasi-jihadist government controlling Syria now, to intermittently intervene in Syria, using defense of the Druze community as a justification. The suspicion is that they're just doing that because they want to pressure the government into giving certain concessions. Among them, they want the new Syrian government to promise not to send any military forces into a de facto buffer zone along the border with Israel. So basically, they don't want any armed forces in southern Syria, effectively. I think that's the main one. I think they also want them to maintain some distance from the Turkish government, diplomatically speaking, since they've been trying to get closer together. I think they've been, that is to say, I think that the Syrian government and the Turkish government have been negotiating a defense treaty. And the Israeli government isn't very comfortable about that because they're concerned that it could result in Turkish forces actually being deployed into Syria. having just gotten the Iranian forces that were in Syria out, I don't think they're eager to see them replaced with another potentially hostile foreign power. But I don't know that there's much they can do to stop it. But regardless, they've been making a fuss about it, hence the airstrikes and ground incursions. Let's see. Some evacuation orders. I think mostly northern Gaza is what this was. Oh yeah, this happened after they resumed the war, after the ceasefire ended. So this is basically in keeping with what they were doing before the ceasefire was implemented, where they would demand that certain specific spaces be evacuated. Civilians specifically were supposed to evacuate those spaces so that military operations could be conducted in those spaces unhindered, quote unquote. And let's see. Oh, notable were there were some protests in Gaza against Hamas that made the rounds in the news for a while. I think the Israeli government was particularly pleased with that. Basically, the protesters just obviously were protesting conditions, didn't think that the war was worth it, etc. It's not really clear how broad-based that sentiment is. And the protest kind of petered out after a while, I think a week or two. I think it does suggest that people are getting exhausted. No surprise, given how bad things have been. But the Israeli government also tried to make it seem like, the population was turning on Hamas wholesale. That seems pretty unlikely to me. Even if they did, it's not as though whatever took their place would be any more favorable to Israel. So that kind of came and went. But it was a notable happening since it suggested that there is some political demand within Gaza to try to end the war. Let's see, miscellaneous stuff. There was a Israeli proposal for a 6-week ceasefire at one point. It would have required Hamas to give up all of its weapons. Again, that's a red line, so unsurprisingly, Hamas rejected that. They also wanted the Israelis to commit to a troop pullout of Gaza, one of their key demands. You can guess what the Israeli response to that was.
No.
Yeah, no. Okay, I had a note here. This was the first time that Israel had added Hamas disarmament as a condition for advancing a ceasefire. Is that true, though? I could have sworn they'd been demanding that before. Well, possibly. Put a pin in that. Let's see. Another item. The Israelis stopped allowing humanitarian supplies into Gaza for about 6 weeks, which is the longest stretch to date in the conflict. And that had a lot of people griping about it. Humanitarian organizations, Palestinians, as you can imagine, Arab countries in the region. I think there has been some let up, and I think I'll get to it a little later, but I think Washington did announce they were going to try to set up a new humanitarian arrangement where supplies could be delivered. Let's see, the best equipped hospital in northern Gaza shut down. That was the Al-Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza City. Israel said it targeted a building at the site, not necessarily the hospital itself, that it says Hamas was using as a command and control center. Obviously, Hamas then denied that. So as a result of the damage, the hospital suspended operations. This is probably 2 months old, thereabouts. So the hospital may have resumed operations since then. Let's see, there was another hospital that was, well, the gate of the hospital was hit by an airstrike. Again, not the hospital itself. This was the Kuwaiti Field Hospital in Al-Mawasi, which is a tented area, apparently, for refugees near Khan Yunis. And as a result, the hospital had to be closed. Again, that might have been temporary. The IDF said that they were trying to assassinate the head of a Hamas terrorist cell and the combat zone commander, whom apparently was outside of the hospital. Anyway, I mentioned this stuff because all of these blew up in the media. Everybody was talking about it when it happened, before it went away and the next accused atrocity happened, as they do with some regularity in Gaza. Number 4, medical convoy was blown up in an airstrike. The IDF said they were armed and ignored warnings, but there was actually a phone recovered from the wreckage that actually had a recording of the convoy when it was struck. And in the recording, there were no weapons seen. So make of that what you will. Probably we'll never know the truth of what exactly happened, but this obviously caused another outcry. Let's see, there was another proposal after that made for a ceasefire that involved exchange of hostages. Nothing came of that. Oh, and the notable thing here is that Hamas's representative in the negotiations said that the group would no longer agree to any interim deals. Somebody in chat was bitching me out for mispronouncing interim. So my apologies.
Please give Agent Smith a little bit of grace. He reads more than he listens. So there are certain words that he's read 100 times and heard 0 times. We welcome corrections, though.
So we do. So interim. So Hamas says that they're not going to accept any further interim deals. If there's going to be an agreement, they say they want it to be a permanent agreement that resolves the conflict in its entirety. So after that, the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, whom I cannot believe is still alive, I think he's 93 years old now. He took charge of the Palestinian Authority when I was in high school. He's been around a long time. Anyway, after that event, he called Hamas, quote, sons of dogs, end quote. He made that insult in a big speech in which he demanded the release of hostages and that Hamas disarm and hand over control of Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. He also had a meeting, apparently, with some Hamas officials that didn't go anywhere. Oh, and he accused Hamas of giving Israel excuses, quote unquote, to continue attacking Gaza and killing people. So pretty strong remarks there. I have it in my notes that these are the strongest remarks targeting Hamas from the PA since the conflict started. No surprise, the PA and Hamas have never been on good terms. But in turn, I don't think anything really comes of that either.
Sorry, what does PA stand for?
Palestinian Authority. It's the pseudo-government that was created as a result of the Oslo Accords back in the 90s to govern certain spaces within the West Bank.
Gotcha, thank you.
And Gaza, technically, but Gaza kind of broke away de facto in 2006 after an election when Hamas kind of sort of took power. It's a whole conversation unto itself. But yeah, that's what the PA is. They directly govern, I think it's Area C territories, and then they jointly govern, what was it? Area B territories. Then I think Area A territories, Israel itself still governs directly. So they kind of carved the West Bank and Gaza into those 3 types of territories. And they were supposed to eventually transition most, if not all of it, to direct control by the PA. But obviously, certain parties in both the Palestinian and Israeli camps didn't want to do that. So the agreement has kind of been frozen, kind of where it was 15, 20 years ago. Let's see. Yeah, everybody's bitching each other out, yada, yada. Some more fighting in Syria broke out. This is more recently. I think this is in the past couple weeks. There was a clash south of Damascus between some armed fighters and some members of the Druze community. Apparently, that was prompted by an audio recording on social media that a man in the Druze community had insulted the Prophet Muhammad. Apparently, a Druze cleric specifically was accused of that. Yeah, that seems to be a pattern with the violence that intermittently breaks out in Syria since the civil war ended. There's some nonsense bullshit that gets passed around social media. Some extremist shitheads use it as an excuse to go and kill some people, and then communal clashes result. Let's see, I could have sworn I had a more organized version of that. Well, anyway, let's see, there was about 100 people killed in those clashes. 71 members of the Druze community, 10 civilians, 35 gunmen who were killed in some kind of ambush while traveling from South Damascus to Damascus. The community specifically was Suwaida, so from Suwaida to Damascus. And then there were 30 members of security forces, government security forces, and allied groups that were also killed. Eventually, the fighting stopped because there was a ceasefire agreed with local Druze leaders. So that ended it. Israel actually participated in that. They launched some airstrikes in retaliation, supposedly to help out and deter further violence. And there was a spiritual leader of the Druze community in Syria, one Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijra. I don't speak a word of Arabic, so I have no idea what the correct pronunciation of that is, so apologies. But this guy condemned the violence, unsurprisingly. Quote, unjustifiable genocidal campaign, end quote. And he said that people in the community were just defending their homes from extremists. The government has taken control of Syria, but the issue is that its direct control over specific armed groups is a little informal. You know, the coalition that seized control of the country under HTS was kind of an umbrella organization. And while they are trying to fold everybody into the army, there are some groups that are kind of de facto still operating independently. And so generally they're the ones that seem to be responsible for this violence. That seemed to be the case in the last big iteration of violence a couple months ago, I think it was. It's kind of problems you have when you're leading a revolutionary government. Things tend to be pretty disorganized for an extended period of time. Let's see, and the Turkish government denounced Israel's military intervention, saying it was, quote, dangerous and unacceptable. So Turkey, again, not happy with Israel, unsurprisingly. So let's see, Israel's position on the new government, full demilitarization of Suwaida, so basically southern Syria, effectively. And Netanyahu also said that the Syrian government is extremist and that the presence of its security forces anywhere near the border would represent a threat to Israel. So again, really pushing hard for that DMZ. Let's see, last two items here. Israel is, well, I shouldn't say Israel is reporting. I read a story that more and more reservists in Israel are increasingly reluctant to report for duty. I don't know how large a scale that is, or even if it's necessarily continuing. I think it's been a couple weeks. But that could suggest, if it's true, that there's more and more fatigue within the Israeli body politic vis-a-vis the conflict. Let's see, and then the Houthis launched some rockets, I think some ballistic missiles, if I'm not mistaken. No, it couldn't have been ballistics. I think it was drones or cruise missiles or something. They launched some projectiles at Israel, and they hit, I think it was Ben Gurion Airport, to which the Israeli government, of course, vowed to retaliate. If we have time, we'll talk about the Houthis later. Basically, the Houthis came to an agreement with the Trump administration to stop attacking shipping in the Red Sea, which is a substantive achievement on the part of Washington there. However, it was noted that the agreement did not include firing at Israel, which I thought was pretty interesting. So that actually has continued. Let's see, and then final item here. Oh, the new humanitarian initiative. So the Trump administration announced that it's going to sponsor a new humanitarian initiative to try to get more aid into Gaza. Basically, they're going to provide aid through a relatively small number of distribution points that are going to be protected and controlled by private security, which is weird because that hasn't really been done before, to my knowledge. Generally, it's either been the Israelis, the Palestinians, or a third-party Arab government that have controlled distribution of aid, either directly or indirectly overseeing the operations of like an NGO that technically is doing it, that is technically gathering the aid and getting it into the country and whatnot. Generally, that's overseen by somebody. So having private security contractors, presumably working for the United States, do it, that's a new thing. Also, the rules that are going to be set up here are going to basically restrict families to one person who is going to come to the collection point, get the aid for the whole family, and then take it out. Furthermore, the people that get aid will have to be vetted. It can't just be anybody. And the reason they're being so strict about it is because they want to make absolutely sure that no aid ends up in the hands of Hamas, even though that's definitely going to happen regardless. But nominally, that's the idea. So as you can imagine, lots of people have been very critical of this. They say that the number of distribution centers is too small, and they're very skeptical that it'll be anywhere near enough to meet the needs of the population. There's also criticism that the distribution points seem to be only located in the southern part of Gaza. So people think this might be de facto encouraging people to evacuate the north of Gaza, which is exacerbating fears that the Israelis may be low-key trying to ethnically cleanse the northern part of Gaza so that they can move into that territory and potentially keep it for themselves. So there's your Israel-Palestine update. Pretty much more of the same overall.
Thank you.
Not a lot new. I think the Syria bit is the most interesting to me, because I don't really know where that goes. And the Turkish government, if it really wants to, probably could get an agreement with the new government that would allow Turkish troops to be present in Syria, which I don't think Israel would like. But again, I don't think they could really stop it. And it would be very interesting because the Turkish military is much stronger than the Iranian military. So I don't think the Israelis would be able to bully the Turks nearly as much as they did the Iranians in Syria. So let's see. So that pretty much gets us up to date. What was the original question?
They were asking about some War of Seven Fronts in Gaza from Netanyahu.
Right. I'm not sure what that's about.
Yeah.
I have heard the Israeli government mention that it is effectively fighting 7 different conflicts, one in Syria, one in Gaza, one kind of sort of in the West Bank. I didn't have it in my notes, but the Israeli military actually has been getting much more active in the West Bank. They've been doing a lot more raids, house demolitions, that kind of thing, because they say that the population there is getting restive and that Hamas is building a base of support, etc. So the Israeli government is kind of counting that as an additional front. There's also the Houthis, that's a 4th one. The Iranians, I guess, would kind of be a 5th one. And 2 more. I'm not sure off the top of my head what the other 2 might be. I'm sure it's something weirdly abstract, given that's pretty much how Netanyahu thinks. But I don't think it's like a 7-front war in Gaza. I don't think that's what they mean. There definitely have been an uptick in Israeli operations, but that's not like a multi-front war. That's just more of the same. I'll point out that I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, the usual disclaimer. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. Participation via chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. We do enjoy the feedback we get on here.
Very true.
Okay. Well, what would you like to go to next?
Don't know what's really stood out. There are just more Trump memes as usual, but I don't really know of anything that was like actually changing something broad. Gas prices.
I do have a Trump highlight reel.
Sure, we could hit that. Get chat fired up a bit.
Well, I know we've been spending a lot of time on it, and I've been trying to think of ways that I can kind of talk about the Trump administration without having it take up like the full 3 hours. So I want to try to shift over to the rest of the world again, and the compromise that I made is the highlight reel, where I just kind of hit the high points. and just kind of blow through them, and maybe that could be it. And if people want to talk more about specific details, we can get into it. But otherwise, the highlight reel can just kind of cover that, and then we can kind of move on.
Works for me.
So there's been a bunch of court rulings. The administration can't use the Alien Enemies Act to deport people. I think there was one that they can't shut down USAID. They can deport Muhammad Khalid, but this is being appealed. They had to release Rumea Ozturk. She was the Tufts student who was arrested. But they are still trying to deport her. The proceedings are continuing there. They just can't detain her. And I think there was another ruling saying that they could not fire something like 40,000 people from a particular agency that they were going after. Some things that the administration has been teasing. They're considering suspending habeas corpus. That was a recent thing for the past couple days. They want to do it vis-a-vis immigrants. So that has a lot of people up in arms. But again, this is just teasing. This isn't something they've said they're definitely going to do. They announced that they're drawing up a Compact of Free Association for Greenland. If you don't know what that is, a Compact of Free Association is just an agreement where basically the United States has control of the other country's foreign policy and is responsible for its defense, and allows its citizens to freely travel to the United States as though they were citizens. They also have the right to work in the United States. That's pretty much the gist of it. Basically, they get certain economic benefits, and in exchange, the United States kind of has strategic control of the country. So the administration is drawing up an agreement in that vein for Greenland. The Greenland government and the Danish government apparently didn't know anything about that, so they're not sure what that's about. Their position doesn't seem to have changed, that they're not interested in selling or otherwise transferring Greenland to American control. Let's see, the administration is drawing up a list of sanctuary cities and states, presumably so that they can pressure them or otherwise bring legal action against them in the near future. The administration has suggested that it wants to send violent criminals with U.S. citizenship to the prison complex in El Salvador. That obviously created some discontent. And they've also kind of teased a third term, although I think in the past couple weeks he said that he would not do that. Make of that what you will. Just other things here. Temporarily restoring legal status of about 200 students they've been trying to deport, although they say they're only doing that until they can develop a new framework to suspend them in the future. So a temporary victory there for the students. The administration arrested a judge in Wisconsin, Hannah Dugan, for allegedly helping an illegal immigrant, supposedly, sneak out of her courtroom. Apparently, they kind of barged into her courtroom and started making demands, which is a pretty good way to piss off a judge. And judges have pretty wide discretion in how they handle things like that in their courtroom. So they were ordered to leave, and then when she was done with her court proceedings, she let out the individual in question out of the courtroom via a kind of side door. So ICE didn't like that, and they detained her. And there was a big stink about the administration arresting judges, but they did eventually release her. I don't know of any further prosecution that's coming out of that. I don't think they're pursuing it. You know, somebody in chat maybe knows better. Please correct me on that. But from what I was reading, my understanding was that judges actually do have discretion in that regard, and they can't really be held liable for that. Let's see, basically just two more things here. Federal Reserve bullshit. You know, the administration had been threatening Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, but in the past couple weeks, they've actually gotten much softer about it. The messaging has been much more conciliatory, and Trump has come out and said that he will not seek to remove Powell very explicitly. He had been kind of teasing it before, but now he's explicitly said no. However, he also said that that Powell's term is going to be up next year. And so there's not any point in removing somebody he's going to replace next year anyway. So Trump may yet get a flunky in charge of the Federal Reserve, in which case we'll be in for a very exciting few years of monetary policy, which will no doubt be very creative. Random stupid shit. Trump joked about the death of the Pope, that he wished he could be Pope. And then the White House released some AI images of Trump as the Pope. He had an interview, I think, with The Atlantic. I'm not sure. Maybe it was ABC. He was asked about the whole immigration issue, and at one point he was asked if he was obligated as president to follow the Constitution and ensure immigrants had access to due process. And his response was, quote, "I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know," end quote. So, as you might expect, there was a lot of people upset about that. And then finally, he announced that he was going to reopen Alcatraz. Make of that what you will.
Interesting.
So that's it for your highlight reel for, I guess, the past month or so.
Really shoots from the hip with the banter.
Yeah, he does. He really does. Oh, random note here, and maybe some people in chat from outside the United States can confirm this, but there was a whole thing on Reddit a couple weeks ago about what baby teeth are called outside the United States. Apparently it's normal to call them milk teeth.
I've never heard that, but okay. I'm in the U.S., so I guess my opinion doesn't matter.
It's not an American thing, but apparently it is pretty much very common in almost the entire rest of the world. I had never heard it myself, so I thought I'd bring it up and ask people if they'd ever heard of that. I thought it was interesting.
Diente de leche. Dagnip says yes. That's what it's called.
Ah. Let's see. What would be good? There's a whole bunch of foreign policy stuff the administration has been doing. Marco Rubio tried to set up some kind of deal with DR Congo. There's been ongoing fighting in Kivu province between Rwandan-backed rebels and the DR Congo government. And much to my surprise, Rubio kind of stepped in and started trying to assist with negotiations. He started doing that after the Congo government issued a public statement that if the United States helped them out, then there would be some kind of concession regarding rare earth materials in eastern Congo that the United States would supposedly have some kind of privileged access to. It was all very ambiguous. They didn't give any details. The Trump administration, I assumed, would ignore that, but apparently they have decided to pursue that particular line of inquiry. And so they have been sponsoring some negotiations between the rebels and the government. I don't think a whole lot has come of that as of yet, but I did think it was notable, given that rare earths has been a kind of impetus for certain other foreign policy actions by the Trump administration. So maybe this could be something they invest a lot more in, or maybe it just disappears in a few months. But just kind of keep it in the back of your head for future reference. Let's see. Middle East, yeah. Oh, Europe. Yeah, we should probably talk about Europe.
What happened?
I kind of mentioned it in passing at one point a few weeks ago, but Marine Le Pen was banned from running for office for 5 years, which is a big deal. If you don't remember who she is the founder, well, not the founder, she was the leader anyway, of the principal right-wing political party in France. It's not a traditional right-wing party. It's one of those sort of populist right-wing parties that's cropped up in Europe over the past 10 years. They've changed their name. I think they were called National Rally at one point. I think they might have changed it since then, though, so I'm not sure. But anyway, she was polling relatively well. Macron obviously is very unpopular. And it was looking like her party was in a pretty good position to actually do well, maybe even win the presidency in the next election. But now she's been banned. The reason she was banned had to do with kind of an obscure law. Basically, it had to do with funding from the European Union that is given to member states, and supposedly Marine Le Pen's party misappropriated some of those funds and used them to pay for staffers working for the party, which apparently you're not supposed to do. There was a whole kerfuffle about the details of it. The party obviously says that the prosecution was using a very narrow definition of what a parliamentary assistant does. Because apparently, in some cases, you can use Euro funds for that, but in some cases, you can't. Very technical stuff. I don't have all the details on that side of it. But the gist of it is that there was a related case involving not National Rally, but a politician in Mayotte. If you don't know what Mayotte is, that's just a French overseas possession. It's one of those residual islands that Western European countries still have left over from their empire days. Mayotte specifically is in the southwestern Indian Ocean. It's, I believe, close to Madagascar. Anyway, there was a French politician there who had a case brought against him. And he had been brought up on some kind of charges, and then as part of his punishment, he had been banned from running for office. And he challenged that, and eventually he lost the case. And the ruling was basically that, I have the note here, the council said the provisional execution of an ineligibility sentence did not infringe on freedom of expression rights and was therefore legal. So because of that, Marine Le Pen was banned from running for office, because she herself and her party had already been convicted of being in breach of this misappropriation thing. But it wasn't clear if she could be legally barred from office under that. But because of the Mayotte ruling, the precedent said is that she could be banned, and so she was. So that was the genesis of that. As you can imagine, there was a big outcry from the right. They say that the deep state is oppressing them and is trying to prevent them from taking power, despite them being one of, if not the most popular individual party in France. And then, of course, their opponents are very happy with that decision. They never liked the far right to begin with, and so anything that kind of puts a crimp in their plans is popular with them. So I'm not here to tell you what to believe. You can make of it what you like, but this is one of the big stories out of French politics over the past month. Let's see. The only other European thing I had, well, besides Ukraine, but that's a whole section unto itself, other than Marine Le Pen being banned, the only other thing I had was on Germany. If I can find it again. Yeah. So this is just from the past couple days. Friedrich Merz, who's going to be the chancellor, actually failed in the first vote to form the new government, which is new. Lots of new unprecedented things happening in the 2020s. You can just add this to the list. Normally after an election, when a new coalition is negotiated in Germany, the vote in the legislature to actually form the coalition and take power is a formality. But in this case, somehow they didn't get enough votes, and they failed the first vote to do so. Now, the votes are anonymous, so we don't exactly know who voted against their party. Because normally, parties are relatively centralized, and you're supposed to vote the way your party boss tells you to. The suspicion is that it's disaffected members of the SPD, the center-left party, which are not really thrilled at being in another coalition government with the main center-right party, the CDU.
What are the main issues that they differ on?
Sorry, what?
What are the main issues that they differ on?
It's typical center-left, center-right stuff. The right wants smaller government, less regulation, slightly more socially conservative by European standards anyway. Still very liberal by American standards, but relatively conservative by European standards. And then the center-left wants relatively more government, more social spending, benefits, etc., and relatively more progressive on social issues of one kind or another. They're not that far apart in the grand scheme of things. And the differences are pretty prototypical. They're not really as dramatic as the differences between them and, say, the AFD or Die Linke or one of those types of parties. But they had already been in a coalition before, years ago. I think, what was her name? Merkel, the former chancellor who'd been in power for like forever, 10, 15 years, whatever it was. She oversaw during much of her rule, I guess is not the right term, during her chancellorship, she was in coalition with the SPD. And she herself was, of course, the head of the CDU, the center-right party. So, you know, coalition government between the main center-left and center-right parties, that's not unusual. But it also kind of grated on people after a while because nobody was really satisfied with it because of all the compromises that had to be made to make the coalition work. That's why the SPD actually took power, I think 4 years ago, thereabouts. There was a big push to get them back into coalition with the CDU, but too many SPD voters were upset at that and wanted the SPD to actually govern as a left-wing party in a left-wing coalition so that they could do all of the left-wing type things that they had not been able to do in coalition with the CDU. And the result of that was the traffic light coalition with the, I forget their name, basically the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party. And it was fairly unwieldy, not very stable. They made a bunch of own goals and ultimately were not able to accomplish a whole lot. So the result is that people were pretty disaffected, and now they're back where they started, back in coalition with the CDU.
Yeah, well, I would guess that just by the simple math, if it's a typical center-right and a typical center-left, then if they form a coalition, it's just a centrist party. So anyone who leans right or left, it feels like they're not getting what they want.
Yeah, pretty much. It's government by consensus, and government by consensus is generally not going to be very decisive unless you have a lot of homogeneity. And generally you only see that in relatively small communities or municipalities. Once you get it to the national level, especially a country with 80 million people, thereabouts, like Germany has, consensus generally is almost synonymous with paralysis, except on issues where there's just broad-based agreement across the political spectrum, which, as you might guess, is pretty rare. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Now, they failed the first vote, but normally that would require them wait a few days for the next vote, another attempt. But the CDU basically made the case that times were extreme. You know, there was lots of drama. There's lots of drama in Europe these days, drama in Germany. And so they can't afford to wait. And so they actually rushed it. They actually tried the second vote very quickly thereafter, and they were able to make it work on the second try. So ultimately, everything worked out in the end. But it was quite notable that the first vote failed. That does suggest there's not inconsiderable enmity amongst certain quarters within the coalition. So that could be a problem in future, depending on how controversial the coalition's public policy is.
You said their votes are anonymous?
Correct.
For this?
Yeah, for the formation of the government.
Is it anonymous for other German stuff that they're voting on, or just specifically this?
I don't know, actually. I think this might be unique, because I think that's just kind of a guardrail. You know, if you're a member of a party that is kind of pussyfooting with an authoritarian party, which has happened before in German history, the anonymity allows you to block the formation of a potential authoritarian government without consequence.
Yeah, I would think that would be a good thing. Kind of makes me wonder if we've ever tried that in the U.S.
It used to be normal, but the trouble with anonymous voting is that it invites corruption, because then people can vote for things that are not in the public's interest, and then if anybody complains about it, you can say, well, I was one of the ones that voted against it, and nobody would be able to prove otherwise. Mm-hmm. So one of the big revolutions of progressive politics in the early 20th century in the United States was trying to mitigate and minimize anonymous voting at pretty much all levels of government. So I think in this case, this is something that's only anonymous for the formation of the government, but I'm not really familiar enough with the German constitution to know for sure. So I invite any Germans or others who may know better to clarify that for us in chat. I would defer to them on that.
I can already see there are a few Germans in chat kind of discussing stuff. Thanks all for hanging out. If you have any local perspectives, we always welcome hearing about them. We're not reading chat during the discussion, but we can catch up with it after. Or see it in the YouTube comments.
And then there was a huge-ass power outage in Spain and Portugal. Not really a discussion item, just a thing that happened that was notable.
Did they not winterize their equipment? It's a Texas joke.
I don't think their winters are that bad. I think it's pretty mild up there in Spain and Portugal.
Yeah. Oh, real quick, completely off topic, because I said Texas, it activated me. I think the Stars are pretty good this season. And they're in the playoffs.
You know, I've been a bad Stars fan, Neuro. I really haven't been following them the past few years.
Oh. My dad was watching them versus, I think it was the Colorado Avalanche, and it got to Game 7. So I haven't watched all of it either. I just heard that they're relatively good this season. I think now they play the most favored team of the NHL, so it'll be kind of spicy.
Yeah, well, I've followed it a little bit the past couple weeks, because obviously the playoffs caught my attention. They beat Colorado in the first round. Not by much, but they did beat them. And yeah, the team they're playing right now won the President's Trophy for best record during the season. The Winnipeg Jets. Which in other circumstances I would be pretty hyped about. I think it's cool that a Canadian team is doing really well. And if they weren't playing the Stars, I would wish well on them, but they're not. They are in fact playing the Stars, so sympathy withdrawn.
Chat says that the Stars destroyed Winnipeg last night. Cool.
Did they?
So they said.
Oh, Game 3 was last night, wasn't it? I haven't seen what happened with Game 3 yet. I saw the Stars got shut out in Game 2. That was a little discouraging.
Best of 7 is pretty nice. That gives teams a lot of time to figure each other out, even if they don't start out strong.
Yeah, it gives you a while to kind of adapt as needed, or if necessary. Yeah, we'll see how the Stars do. They've been, I think, in the Western Conference Finals 2 years in a row now.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be pretty cool to make it a third time, although it would be even better if they could actually win in the conference final.
True.
But we'll see. But yeah, I'm a pessimist at heart, so I'm mostly just hoping a Canadian team wins it. Canadian team hasn't won the Stanley Cup since 1993, as I recall. Montreal Canadiens, way back in the day.
It's as Canadian as it gets.
Depending on how you vote.
Well, I mean,
there might be some Quebecois voters that don't agree with that.
True, yeah. We are the true Canadians.
Yeah, we didn't talk about the Canadian election, did we?
How did that go?
Pretty much as expected. Carney actually did win. Well, I guess I should say the Liberals won, but Liberals as led by Carney. He doesn't have a big majority, though. It is a little slim. I think he is going to need a little help from one of the smaller parties. Not a whole lot, but if you don't have a majority, you don't have a majority. So we'll see how that works out. But given that they were like 20 points down in the polls just a few months ago, it's a pretty dramatic turnaround. Quite surprising. Yes, something similar actually happened in Australia. I wasn't even aware Australia had an election pending. But they did, and they held it, and the center-left party, I believe, was able to win. Despite the fact that they were not entirely popular. The Conservative candidate apparently kind of sunk them. I think his name was Dutton, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, he had kind of an edge early on, but he had a bunch of what you might call own goals. A bunch of self-inflicted mistakes that he didn't need to make that kind of cost him the election. Yeah, one of the things they tried to do is to kind of shift over to more of a culture war type campaign late in the election, and apparently that turned people off. They didn't really like that, especially with all of the Trump drama going on. So there was other stuff too. Obviously, there's more to Australian politics than just the United States, but that was one of the things I read that undermined his campaign. Also, he's just not very relatable. I think I read that as well. Just one of those kinds of guys.
We do have some Australians who watch the stream, and one of them was posting in Discord. Apparently, if you vote in the election, you get a grilled sausage. Like, that's a tradition for them, is they grill sausages and stuff. Not even stereotyping, it's what they do. And I was like, that's pretty cool.
That sounds very Australian. Well, good for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have that here.
We just get a sticker. You can't eat that. That's gross.
Sometimes
I voted.
Let's see. Okay, I found it in my notes. So some of the factors in the Australian election: anti-Trump sentiment, partly. Dutton couldn't get out of his own way. There was apparently a bunch of gaffes that he made during the campaign, and then he leaned into the culture war late in the campaign, which put people off. And also, I had a note here that Labor... Wait, is Labor correct? I'll talk about that in a minute. Basically, the left-wing party was able to win despite having really passive messaging that allowed the conservatives to define them. So in that sense, the conservatives actually had initiative in the election and still lost. It's a little surprising. And for those interested, some of the other issues in the election, tell me if this sounds familiar. Housing costs, healthcare costs, inflation, immigration, indigenous rights.
Yeah.
Let's see. Where's Canada? I had them around here somewhere.
It's north of the United States. Got him.
Oh, fair point. It is, in fact, north of the United States.
Yes.
Well, I had some notes on Canada somewhere, but I have no idea where I put them. Oh. But yeah, one of the things, well, I watched a YouTube video is what I did, and they were kind of looking at the Canadian election, and one of the things I thought was interesting is that Bloc Québécois, which is the main Quebec separatist party in Canada, their leader apparently made a statement during the election that Canada's not a real country, it's just sort of artificial. And then when people got mad at him, he actually doubled down and said it again. So apparently that wasn't doing them any favors.
What is it then, a city-state?
Just an artificial amalgamation of different nations that would otherwise be independent. Presumably Quebec among them, but maybe also Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, what have you. There's not insignificant differences between the provinces of Canada. Quebec is just the most notable in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, to bring this full circle, I don't know that that guy thinks that Quebec is necessarily a part of Canada in anything more than a legal sense. But I think most people in Quebec, probably not that extreme. In fact, I think it was the Liberals that won Quebec. I think they won the most seats in Quebec this election. Yeah, Bloc Québécois, I believe, lost seats, if I'm not mistaken. Canada and Australia confuse the shit out of me, because they're both Anglo-Saxon countries, but they have different names for their left-wing parties. Like in Canada, it's more like the United States. They call their left-wing party the Liberals.
Mm-hmm.
But in Australia, it's Labour, which is more like the UK.
Gotcha.
But in turn, in Australia, their Conservatives are the Liberals. So it always trips me up, because I always assume Canada and Australia would be pretty similar in that regard, but they're not. I have to remember every time.
Just think of them as neolibs, he says.
We're doing okay on time.
Yeah, hour 15 in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'll still got a bunch of time.
Yeah, you were able to sum up Trump pretty fast. Sometimes that can take 2 hours. So
Yeah, I try to get it out of the way. I've still got the critique of the tariff thing, but I sense that people are getting a little bored of that.
yeah.
I've noticed that in some of the comments in chat and YouTube. So I won't belabor it unless people want to. I thought the critique was more interesting than the specifics and the details that we went over, but we've already done a lot of it, so maybe a break is in order. And the more time we wait to do the critique, the more time the administration has to prove me wrong and actually kind of make something resembling a sensible trade policy. Not there yet, but they are at least moving in that direction. We haven't talked about trade developments over the past month, but they have been agreeing to something resembling deals. No actual trade deals like Trump has been saying, but they have been negotiating something.
Firming
So
up
that's
the
to their
concepts
credit.
of a plan.
Huh? Oh,
Firming up the
concept
concepts of a
yeah.
plan.
Let's see, we did have some new data out as far as the US economy. I think people were particularly looking forward to that just to see how the economy was doing in the first quarter, given some of the Trump gyrations that have happened in markets. I think overall it was a pretty mixed bag. It wasn't as bad as Trump critics would have had it, but it wasn't exactly great either. The upside is that consumption was pretty robust. It actually spiked. The downside, though, is that consumer sentiment is actually falling. Investment is stagnating. It's not going down, but it's not really going up either. And then inflation expectations are up. Inflation is still okay. It's increasing, but it's mild. So that's doing relatively well. But expectations are going up. And as we've discussed before, when inflation expectations go up, generally inflation follows. And that can be dangerous if it continues for a prolonged period of time. Then you end up with self-fulfilling prophecy of inflation, tit-for-tat increases in inflation that just self-propagate into the future. So I'm sure the Federal Reserve is watching that particular data point very closely. Let's see, employment was pretty robust, not a lot of change there. And then, yeah, inflation, I mentioned. So, not bad. That's not the worst. You know, it's more or less on trend. But some leading indicators are negative. You know, consumer sentiment, inflation expectations. That's kind of bad mojo. So something needs to change if we're going to avoid a downturn of some kind. And as far as consumption spiking, what I've read is that that's being interpreted as consumers trying to buy stuff before inflation hits. Again, inflation expectations are up. A lot of people expect the tariffs to cause prices to go up. So there's a good number of consumers that are trying to get ahead of that and buying stuff they want now while it's relatively cheap. So if that is the correct interpretation, that doesn't really speak well of the spike in consumption. That's not an organic thing that happened because the economy is doing well. That's just happening because there's this wave coming that's going to do economic damage. So we'll see how it all shakes out. Again, the trade policy seems to be a big part of a lot of this. And so if that kind of settles down and there's more certainty, we could see a return to relatively more predictable, stable data. I'm sure markets would appreciate that. But the administration hasn't really signaled that's what it wants to do, at least not yet. You know, again, they're trending in that direction, but they're not there. And so the result is that markets are still kind of wobbly.
Do we still have the cheese caves?
Cheese caves?
Yeah. Didn't you say there were like rumors of some caves of cheese that we keep just in case?
Oh, yeah, I think we did, actually. It's been some time since we talked about it. Yeah, I think it was like the emergency cheese reserve.
Just sounds so funny to me. I know it's valid, but...
Well, oh. Nobody asked about India?
What happened in India?
Yeah, wait. Okay, let me check. I don't blame you if you haven't heard of it, but I'm genuinely curious. Have you heard anything about India and Pakistan over the past week?
Oh, I think someone asked about it.
Okay. Yeah, there was the big terrorist attack in, I shouldn't say big, it was like 12 dead. Pahalgam in Kashmir. Supposedly they attacked some Indian tourists. And there's a rumor, I don't know if it's been verified or not, but supposedly they were specifically checking to see who was circumcised or not, to see who was Muslim and not Muslim, so they would know who to kill.
What?
Whenever there's any kind of communal violence in India, or certainly anything involving Pakistan, there's always a lot of rumors that run rampant on India's internet, so it can be hard to kind of figure out what's true and what's bullshit. But at the very least, there was a terrorist attack. The Indian government generally blames those on Pakistan, since the Pakistani military, and especially its intelligence agency, the ISI, retains ties to paramilitary groups that operate both inside and outside of Kashmir. So there was some talk for a while about what the Indian government would do to retaliate. Didn't seem like much was happening for a while. The Indian government started to raise eyebrows by kind of appealing to the international community for something like permission to launch airstrikes into Pakistan. And eventually that's exactly what they did. They actually did launch actually a whole variety of munitions into Pakistan, mostly in Kashmir, which is not unprecedented. But there were actually a couple strikes into Pakistan proper, which was a notable escalation from previous iterations of violence like this. I think overall they struck terrorist training camps, command and control centers, stuff like that. Supposedly they have intelligence about locations in that vein. And the munitions they used ranged. I saw a YouTube video kind of exploring what information there's available about the nature of the strikes, and apparently they used a combination of Ramos cruise missiles, manned aircraft, unmanned drones, and some small drone bombers of the kind that have been used in Ukraine. Just a whole panoply of different things. And the theory I read is that the Indian military is basically using this as an excuse to test out some of its equipment. Since it's been, 6 years now, I think, since the last kerfuffle with Pakistan. So whenever these kind of crop up, it's an opportunity to test out systems. Hence the variety. Pakistan retaliated with some strikes, I think drone strikes specifically in India, which India then retaliated to, and then Pakistan hit back with even more drone strikes. For the most part at this point, it seems to be mostly cross-border artillery strikes and then drones, which is not too bad in the grand scheme of things. Unmanned drones are less escalatory. Well, destroying unmanned drones is less escalatory than, say, downing a manned platform, because then you have the issue of killing the pilot or maybe retrieving the pilot, and then you have to negotiate for his release, etc. That's more tense than just shooting down a robot. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, that means that things are not as out of control as they seem, but on the other hand, it could be that both parties are underestimating the possibility of escalation stemming from even just drone use, because you never know where things are going to go, who's going to die, what's going to get blown up, and any one thing could be the thing that sets you on the road to out of control tit-for-tat escalation. So I think both countries are mindful of that, and they're kind of keeping this within reason. We've had violence like this in the past, in 1999 with the Kargil War. Well, I guess the Kargil War is not like this. That was an actual war. But after that, there were intermittent kerfuffles. The 2008 Mumbai terrorist attack that resulted in some violence. I think 2019 was the most recent one. There was another one in 2016. So, cross-border violence with the Indian and Pakistani militaries kind of sniping at each other after some kind of incident, that's not new. They have some experience dealing with this. So generally what happens is that there is some kind of superficial retaliation, possibly followed by bloodletting. That's not uncommon. And then eventually they de-escalate after a few weeks or maybe months, and then things slowly go back to normal. That's been the pattern with these kinds of outbreaks of violence before. I don't really see much reason why this would be different, especially given that the terrorist attack in this case was much more mild than previous incidents. The 2008 attack in particular was one of the larger terrorist attacks of the war on terror period from 2000 to 2010, roughly. And if that didn't lead to a war, I don't think this one will. This one was much smaller in scale. And I think they did agree to a ceasefire yesterday. There were some ceasefire violations reported, but that's not unusual. So that seems to be holding for the most part. So it could be that this wraps up relatively early for them. Yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it. Yeah, the Pakistani government in particular is probably looking for de-escalation. They're not very popular right now. Keep in mind, the Pakistani military pretty much is the government in Pakistan, and they've been delegitimized over the past 5-6 years owing to the whole Khan crisis. They had the reformist former cricket superstar get into power, partly because they formed an alliance with the military. And there was then a big falling out between Khan and the military. And, there's been cases in the past where the Pakistani military pushed out a civilian government because they didn't like what they were doing. And generally, a military junta ensued that would rule for 5 to 10 years until they gave nominal power back to civilians. But in this case, they haven't really been able to get away with it to the same degree. There's been a lot of public pushback this time. Khan is fairly popular. The other political parties are very much not popular. They're seen as sort of corrupt establishment entities. And so Khan, even though he's in jail and his party has more or less been disbanded at this point, still manages to command enough support to spark protests, occasionally riots, what have you. So while normally during a flare-up like this in Indo-Pak violence, there would be a rally around the flag effect, so to speak. In this case, I've read that it hasn't really happened so much. Pakistani social media isn't full of nationalists baying for blood like they have in the past. In this case, it's relatively subdued. So I don't think the Pakistanis are really looking for escalation here. I don't know that they weren't responsible for it. It could be that the military was looking for a wag the dog situation to try to take the domestic political pressure off. But it could also be that this terrorist group, Lashkar-e-Taiba, was acting on its own initiative, or maybe at the behest of ISI. God knows what the ISI is up to. They tend to keep to themselves. It's a pretty opaque group. So they may have had their own reasons for doing it if they were the ones that did it. Regardless, we don't really know. And regardless of who is responsible for it, I don't think the Pakistani military is actually looking for full-on confrontation here. And I think the Indian government is in the same boat in that regard. I think they've got other problems. They're trying to negotiate a trade deal of some kind with the Trump administration. They're trying to improve relations with China right now. And China, of course, has very good ties with Pakistan. I think we've talked before about how Pakistan and China actually have a very strong alliance between. It's not a treaty alliance, but, strategically speaking, they're very close partners, much more close than, say, Pakistan and the United States, for example. So overall, I think both parties just want to get past this. There will be the usual ritual bloodletting. They have to retaliate to some degree to try to discourage further violence. But once they get out of the way, they're probably going to move on and try to tamp things down and then focus on other things.
I see. Chat's asking if there's a confirmation of how many planes went down in the dogfight.
No, there's people who follow that more closely than I do, that I follow online. Some Twitter analysts, YouTubers, they don't know. There's too many contradictory claims. There's people posting fake claims. They'll post video from incidents years ago claiming that it's from the most recent violence. Nobody knows for sure, and neither government is being forthright about it either. So we probably won't know for a while. I don't even know that there's really a lot of dogfighting actually happening. I was pretty skeptical about that until there was a U.S. official that said that there had been some dogfights. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Most aerial combat now is at range. You fire at the other aircraft when they're miles away. Mm-hmm. Using a radar-guided missile of some kind, or maybe a semi-radar-guided missile, if that's still what you're using. But generally, dogfighting, I wouldn't think, would still be a big part of aerial warfare. We've kind of been moving away from it for a while. It doesn't
think they
surprise
could
me
still squeeze in a Top Gun-style movie in Bollywood?
They already did.
They did?
They already did.
Oh, wow.
No, after Top Gun Maverick came out, there was a bunch of copycat movies. China made a copycat, and then India also did.
Okay.
So one of my plans for the far-flung future, whenever I get around to it, is to have a night where I just watch all three movies. Top Gun Maverick, since I still haven't seen it, and then the Chinese ripoff, and then the Bollywood ripoff, all in one night. That sounds like a lot of fun to me.
Yeah.
But an excuse to imbibe much junk food. But yeah, as far as the details of it, apparently there were some dogfights, at the very least some degree of aerial combat, and they have taken losses. Supposedly the Indians have taken more losses. That wouldn't surprise me if it was the case, because they technically were the ones attacking. They were the ones trying to enter Pakistani airspace. So that means that the Pakistanis would have had the advantage of their air defenses, surface-to-air missile systems, in addition to, fighters and whatnot. But the reference was specifically to dogfights, which suggests aircraft, not SAMs. So I'm not sure how that happened, but allegedly it has, and apparently the Pakistanis got the better of it. But we'll have to see in order to see whether or not that ends up being verified and confirmed. Only time will tell. I have seen some analysts comment that if it's true that the Pakistanis got the better of it, then that would speak well to Chinese fighters, which the Pakistanis actually have been using more recently. For those who maybe haven't been keeping up with Pakistani foreign policy over the past 10 years, I don't blame you if you haven't. Pakistan's relations with the United States have kind of nosedived over the past 10 years, and especially since the United States got out of Afghanistan. That was pretty much the main reason the U.S. still had strong ties to Pakistan. And with the end of the war, not really a lot of reason to continue bribing them with military aid of one kind or another. So, and that's on top of just general deterioration in relations. Obviously, even during the Obama administration, there were a number of incidents that resulted in aid being curtailed. So at this point, the Pakistani military is actually more Chinese than it is American. They get most of their hardware from them, rather than U.S. producers. So Chinese fighters seem to be what they've been using in the recent kerfuffle. I don't doubt they still have some American, but it's the Chinese fighters that have gotten the most attention. And the fact that they might have actually beaten Indian aircraft is pretty notable.
Sorry, is that Chinese airplanes or Chinese piloting the airplanes? When you say Chinese fighters?
Aircraft.
Okay, thank
Definitely no Chinese pilots in Pakistan. The Pakistani military would not tolerate that.
Okay.
They like to be self-sufficient in that regard. Yeah, the Indians, I think, have been using Rafales, or Rafales, however it's pronounced. Have you ever heard of the Euro fighter?
It sounds familiar.
It was developed in the 70s as a joint project between different European states, I think specifically Germany, Britain, and France, maybe Italy too. The idea was to create an indigenous European fighter so that they could just have their own instead of buying American. And the project went well. They did finish it. There is a Eurofighter that different countries use today. But the French didn't like the direction it was taking. They preferred to have all of the production in France. They preferred to have decisions made. I don't remember all of the details, but basically there were certain design features they wanted that other parties didn't want. So they actually took what progress had been made in the program and then used that as the basis for a new program that they started to build an entirely indigenous French aircraft, and that's what became the Rafale. So the Rafale was basically like the French Eurofighter. And they've been fairly successful at selling it to different countries that are interested in a relatively high-quality Western aircraft that is not as expensive as American aircraft, which are probably better overall in terms of performance, but cost much more. And so the Rafale is an attractive alternative for that reason. India ended up preferring them over, I think, the F-16s, I think. Might have been F-22s, actually. I don't remember specifically what it was in the competition. But basically, the French beat the Americans, and so the Indian Air Force has Rafales now. I think most of their Air Force is actually still Russian. So it could be that the dogfights that we're talking about here may have actually been Chinese fighters versus Russian fighters, interestingly. But it's the Rafale that seems to be getting more attention here. So it could be that the Chinese fighter beat the Rafale, and that this suggests that the Chinese aeronautics industry is catching up to the West. Although I would point out that the Chinese were probably sending better versions of their aircraft. They probably don't have nearly as many restrictions on technology transfer and whatnot. Generally, when countries like the United States and France, although more so the United States, they tend to export dressed down versions of their aircraft. The export variants of the aircraft they use are generally less capable than the indigenous versions. So it could be that the Rafales India is using are not as capable as the Rafales in, say, France proper. So it's not entirely an apples to apples comparison there. High quality Chinese aircraft versus handicapped Rafales is not entirely a fair fight. But that also could be me coping. It may be that it's a moot point regardless. You know, if the export version is the version everybody has, then effectively that's the version that it should be measured by. So in that case, the Chinese fighter may actually be the more economical buy if it is in fact beating the more expensive competition. We'll see. It'll all get cleared up probably in the next month or two. But until then, it's mostly just speculation. I did have a note here about the Indus Water Treaty. One of the things India did in retaliation for the terrorist attack was to suspend a water treaty that it had had with Pakistan regarding regulation of the Indus River since 1965. Oh, 1960, actually. I have it in my notes. The Indus Waters Treaty of 1960. So that treaty had been kept in place even during the Indo-Pak Wars in 1965 and 1971 and 1999. So 3 separate Indo-Pak wars, this treaty was left alone. Neither party violated it. But this time, India has decided that it's going to abrogate the treaty. So this is a big deal because something like 80% of the irrigated water in Pakistan comes from the Indus. So India could do significant damage here if it really does a lot to redirect the flow of the river. However, keep in mind that because of the treaty, India has not built substantive infrastructure along the river thus far. So there's not like a whole bunch of dams in place that the Indian government can use right now to redirect the flow or otherwise restrict the flow of water into the Indus River downstream into Pakistan. Because they've abrogated the treaty, they could construct those now going forward, but as you can imagine, building a whole ass dam, especially across a river as big as the Indus, is going to take a while. That's probably a project that'll take at least a couple years, probably longer. So in the future, if India does go forward with construction of dams along the Indus River, they could restrict the flow of water to Pakistan, but the immediate ramifications of suspending the treaty are pretty much nil. There's not a whole lot India can do in that regard. So this is more of a future threat than a present threat. And if things go the way that I think they're going to go, I suspect that they're going to end up coming back to the treaty. I think the suspension of the treaty is probably just a temporary threat that they're using to try to look tough in front of a domestic political audience and also potentially scare the Pakistani government. So in a month or so, this could be a moot point. But I just thought it was important to note that despite all of the talk about the treaty being suspended, the immediate implications are pretty narrow. There's not actually much that the Indian government can do in the short term with now that they've left the treaty.
Chat's asking if you're an economist or if you have an OF.
Pray to your God, whatever God that may be, that I
or
never
goddess.
did an OF.
Okay.
Huh?
Or goddess.
Or goddess, yeah. Yeah, I'm not the kind of person that should be having an OnlyFans, believe me.
But it's a fair and valid question.
Lately. It's a valid question. I'm definitely more economist than OnlyFans model. Mercifully so for everybody who has eyes.
Well, you have a good voice, so that's a start.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I need to diet. I've been eating too much lately. Too much good food about. There's a nice Thai place I found. That's been my trouble. They have really good pad Thai. And they sell it with good. Yeah, it's great, but especially when it's made with good seasoning and they allow you to have fried tofu. Not every Asian place that sells pad thai sells it with fried tofu, but this one does, and so I have a particular affinity for it.
Nice.
Not been good for my waistline. Very good for my taste.
Mm-hmm.
Good stuff. Also, they have traditional tea, milk tea specifically, which I appreciate. Ever since I went to Thailand, I've had an affinity for Thai milk tea. It's very good.
Mm-hmm.
I've been
Do you like
thinking about trying
Vietnamese
to...
coffee? I don't think you're a coffee guy, are you?
No, I don't drink. Well, I don't consume caffeine. It tends to make me sick.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so no coffee. But have you tried Vietnamese coffee? Is it notable?
Oh yeah. It's basically super strong and quite sweet. They use condensed milk instead of regular milk, and it just ends up being like pretty high caffeine content, pretty high sweetness.
Interesting.
Egyptian coffee is also really good. That's something that I was
Egyptian
impressed by
coffee?
going there. Yeah,
Really?
it's closer to how I make coffee for myself. It's like really thick, like sludge almost. In the U.S., we have Americano, which is coffee that's watered down, so it's a lot weaker than European coffee. But Egyptian coffee, from the stuff that I had, took it even a step further than European. Chat saying taste line greater than waistline. There you go.
Yeah, slip of the tongue there.
No, they're saying that you should prioritize your taste line over your waistline.
Oh, I see.
Your pronunciation was good. This time.
This time.
But next time we won't be so lenient. Ask Mr. Smith if Kosovo is Serbia.
Oh, fuck.
Is that a trap? I don't know what that's trying to do.
That's a good question to start an argument in virtually any chat, especially one with people from the Balkans in it.
Ooh, someone's stirring the pot.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the whole Kosovo thing?
I recall a Kosovo agreement, but I don't remember what it was.
Gosh, where do we start with Kosovo? Supposedly, it's kind of the motherland of the Serbian people. And so they think that they kind of have a claim to it because they see it as their origin.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened is that for reasons that are rather convoluted, the ethnic makeup of Kosovo changed over time. So presently, the ethnic majority in Kosovo is Albanians. And they don't always get along with the Serbs. Who's more at fault there depends on who you ask. I'm not even going to bother getting into the whole history of ethnic violence between Kosovo Albanians and Serbs, but particularly in the 80s, that particular violence really popped off. That happened after Tito died. That happened after Tito died. Are you familiar with Tito? Maybe I should ask.
No.
Oh, okay. So Yugoslavia controlled all of that: Serbia, Kosovo, Croatia, etc. And Tito was the dictator of Yugoslavia from the end of World War II up until he died in, I want to say, like 1981, whenever it was. And he's generally credited with keeping the country together because during World War II, there was considerable ethnic violence between anybody and everybody in the Balkans. There was a lot of bad blood, but Tito kind of tamped it down for several decades. But after he died, the political system loosened up and nationalism returned to the fore in Yugoslavian politics. And again, for reasons that I'm not sufficiently familiar with, there was an uptick in violence between Serbs and Albanians, in particular in Kosovo. Should I tell the bottle story? There's a number of reasons for the violence, but one story in particular stands out. People in the Balkans probably know exactly what I'm talking about. There was a Serbian farmer who lived in Kosovo, and he was admitted to the hospital. And his problem is that he had a glass bottle inserted up his anus that he could not get out.
Uh-oh.
And when they asked him about it, he said that some Albanian Kosovar extremists had violated him, basically beaten him and sodomized him with the bottle against his will. And of course, this made the rounds in the news and the community, and supposedly it was one of the contributing factors for escalating violence in the region. It came out later, much later, that this guy had not in fact been sodomized by militants, but rather had done it himself, because he was basically pleasuring himself with the bottle. And he was so embarrassed at getting caught, because of course once he got it stuck he had to get help, that he refused to admit that and instead had blamed it on militants.
Let's just start a war instead. What the hell? It'd be really embarrassing to admit this, so we're just gonna start a conflict in the Balkans. It's probably
well, to be fair, he probably didn't think it would start a whole last war. And really, that's not like the reason it started. But the joke answer for why there was ethnic violence is because this guy was sodomizing himself with a glass bottle.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but anyway, the violence obviously just kind of spiraled out over the course of the 80s and eventually led into the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. Now, Kosovo was kind of part of that, but most of the Yugoslav wars were focused in Bosnia. They especially focused on Croats versus Serbs versus Bosniaks. The Bosniaks actually fought a lot with the Croats too, but eventually they ended up in a kind of de facto alliance against the Serbs. So eventually that iteration of the Yugoslav wars ended, I think, with the 1995 Dayton Accords. And Kosovo didn't really crop up until 1999, I want to say. And the issue there is that there had been ongoing ethnic violence, and the Serbian government responded to it by engaging in ethnic cleansing. And that, of course, attracted the United States and Europe, which then organized an intervention. And the result of that intervention is that Kosovo de facto became an independent state under the protection of NATO, the European Union, and the United States. So the Kosovar population says that they're an ethnic Albanian people that was being ethnically cleansed by Serbians who deserve their independence because the Serbian government can't be trusted. Now, the Serbian government, in contrast, argues, as it always has, that Kosovo is an integral part of Serbia that was illegally broken off from Serbia by an international intervention, and that it should be returned to its rightful home in Serbia. So whether or not Kosovo rightfully belongs to Serbia or should be independent, largely a matter of politics. In general, the international community has sided with Kosovo, but there are still a number of states that have sided with Serbia, mostly China, Russia, etc., your usual suspects. I would say that Kosovo has been more successful getting international recognition than, say, Abkhazia or South Ossetia or some of the other little statelets that Russia has kind of propped up. Russia actually explicitly cites Kosovo as justification for doing that, by the way. All the little separatist republics they've supported in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, they say that if the West can do it in Kosovo, then why can't we do it in these places? Yeah, Kosovo's done okay since then. Much less genociding, fortunately. I think the KLA, the main rebel group, which then went on to govern Kosovo as the governing party, has gotten into trouble a couple times. As you might guess, they're not entirely clean themselves. They engaged in a bit of drug trafficking, organ trafficking as well, I think is another of the big accusations. So some of their leaders have been hauled into court over some of that. But beyond that, Kosovo is just continuing to try to resolve its situation with Serbia. The issue has not been finalized. Serbia still claims it. Europe still has not fully recognized Kosovo as being independent. They would prefer some kind of negotiated settlement one way or the other. So they have not foisted Kosovo independence on Serbia like they could. But the result of that is that the conflict has just kind of dragged out. Well, not conflict, but dispute. The dispute over Kosovo has dragged out over decades because there's been no clear resolution, either one negotiated or one imposed. So that's why that's kind of a inflammatory question.
Mm-hmm. I see. Well, thank you for taking a stab at it.
I think Kosovo is also the place that has a statue of Bill Clinton, if I'm not mistaken. It was the Clinton administration that kind of fought for their independence, so to speak, or at least is largely responsible for it. So they built a statue of him in their capital. I think there was another one, too, that built a statue of George W. Bush. I don't remember where that was, though. Some weird statues in the Balkans, if you're an American, suffice to say. I don't think that Bush Jr. or Clinton are necessarily remembered as some of our statue-worthy presidents.
Yeah. There's a place in downtown Rapid City here in South Dakota where there's a statue of each of the U.S. presidents, and they're apparently to scale as well. So you can kind of see what different presidents look like and stand next to them. It's kind of a fun touristy thing to do.
Does Trump have one yet?
I actually don't know.
They're going to have to put it behind protective glass.
South Dakota is a lot more pro-Trump than many other places, though. So.
Fair point. Fair point. What else did we have here? There was a trade agreement between India and the UK. I don't know if that's of interest or not, but it does kind of peripherally relate to the trade negotiations between India and the United States. So we could get into that a little bit if people are interested.
Sounds cool to me.
Well, it's been in the cards for a while. The UK, obviously, after Brexit, was trying to sign trade agreements with anybody and everybody they could. Didn't really work out too well, but they have continued to try. And one of the agreements that's been negotiated over time is a trade agreement with the Indians. And that didn't seem to be going anywhere, but the Starmer administration, currently in power in the UK, made a big push over the past couple months to try to finally make it happen. And it seems they've been successful. And they were able to get some decent concessions, much to my surprise, but there's some context explaining that I'll get to. The details are not entirely impressive. Basically, 90% of UK goods will see tariffs fall over time. I think it's over 10 years is the time frame they had in mind. So let's see, 85% of those will fall to zero over that 10-year period. Whiskey is going to go immediately from 150% to 75%. I should say that these are Indian tariffs on British goods we're talking about here. So Indian tariffs on British goods are going to fall over the course of 10 years. For 85% of British goods, they'll fall to zero at the end of that 10-year period. For whiskey, they're going to fall immediately from 150% to 75%, and then they're eventually going to fall to 40% over the 10-year time frame. Cars were particularly notable. India agreed to reduce immediately tariffs on British cars from 100% to 10%. And then there's some miscellaneous other goods that are going to be included in this. The exact tariff reductions were not included, but the specific goods that the agreement is going to encompass include lamb, salmon, cosmetics, soft drinks, chocolate and biscuits, aerospace, electrical machinery, and medical devices. Presumably that's not a complete list, but those are the ones the article specifically listed. On the flip side, 99% of Indian goods will see British tariffs fall to 0%, either immediately or over time. So these includes notably textiles, marine products, leather, sports goods, toys, gems and jewelry, engineering goods, and auto parts. I had a note here specifically that UK tariffs were actually already really low. I think the average was around 3 or 4%. So for Britain to agree to lower tariffs from 3 or 40% to 0%, that's not that big a deal overall. That isn't going to make a big difference to their trade as far as importing Indian goods. So that's a relatively mild concession for them. India, in terms of the tariffs, was making much bigger concessions. Automotive tariffs going from 100 to 10% in particular, and not even over 10 years, but like immediately. That's a serious concession on their part. Some other items in the deal: procurement. Generally, trade agreements allow signatories to reserve government procurement for domestic producers, because generally government procurement is things like defense or food, stuff like that. Stuff that's very strategically sensitive, relatively speaking. And so they're generally given carve-outs for stuff like that. Some more recent trade agreements over the past 10 to 20 years have sought what's called regulatory alignment, basically trying to open up services sectors that are traditionally closed in trade agreements. And one of the ways they do that is opening up government procurement. So they negotiated that here. They have not fully opened government procurement in both countries to the other, but it's going to be relatively more open. So the UK will have more access to India's procurement market, including, according to the article, goods, services, and construction. That's a pretty broad, so I'm not sure why they added that, but apparently it's pretty broad-based access. In some cases, they're even going to get exclusive treatment under India's Made in India policy. So that's an industrial policy that the Indian government has been trying to implement over the past, I want to say 10 years, basically since Modi has been in power, to try to stimulate, so to speak, India's manufacturing sector. If you're familiar with India's economy, you know that India's manufacturing is not really up to par. It's not as advanced as other parts of the Indian economy, especially the services sector. Let's see. There was a tax agreement, double contribution. Basically, if you're an Indian guy and you work for a company that transfers you to work in the UK for a little while, you don't have to pay taxes to both the Indian and the British national insurance programs. Basically, these are employment insurance programs. If you're American and you don't know what that is, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's basically a tax people pay into unemployment benefits. So while they're working, they pay the tax, and then if they ever get unemployed, then they can withdraw money from the national program so that they have coverage while they're unemployed. So countries that don't have double contribution agreements will, as a result, see their citizens paying into both unemployment schemes at the same time, both the host country and their country of origin. Signing an agreement like this is not that big a deal. The UK itself already has agreements like this with a whole range of countries. So in that sense, it's actually more surprising that they didn't have one already. So they've taken the opportunity to finally implement one. So not a big achievement, but notable. India wanted the UK to give it an exemption to its carbon border adjustment tax mechanism. They don't have that mechanism in place right now, but they've been seriously discussing it. And if and when it's actually implemented, India wanted an exemption from it because obviously a lot of Indian manufacturing and industry is relatively dirty, so to speak. It's not clean or environmentally friendly like the British might like. So the British ultimately resisted that. India did not get an exemption. However, the Indian government said that it would retaliate in future if it did end up being subject to that in future. So this could be something that they return to in a future negotiation. And if they don't, this could actually scupper the existing agreement, since it may be that India retaliates by reimposing high tariffs. So that's an interesting space to keep an eye on in future. We'll see what happens with that. So implications here. What do we take away from all of this? Again, it's significant that India lowered tariffs so much on its automotive market. Lowered tariffs on cars specifically. The automotive market is a market that India has actually protected for decades now. They've always wanted to try to develop an indigenous automotive industry, but it's been very hit or miss over time. There's been some foreign companies that have successfully invested. I think we talked before about how successful the Japanese company Suzuki has been in the Indian automotive market. But there's not a lot of other examples, and the Indian market remains relatively dependent on foreign partnerships. So the fact that India is finally opening up that market if only to the British, that's a significant concession, and that suggests that the Indian government may actually be interested in further liberalization, not only to the automotive market, but maybe to other sectors of the manufacturing of their manufacturing industry that they have traditionally protected. So that would make a big sea change in terms of Indian industrial policy. In trade policy, it could have big ramifications for the Indian economy. It could mean for example, much cheaper manufactured goods of one kind or another if they do this on a larger basis. It could also lead to more investment if certain markets are opened up more, which could obviously boost the Indian economy significantly, and Indian manufacturing in particular. And also it could lead to, what am I thinking of? Well, I think those are the main things: investment, employment, manufacturing boost, and also significantly making the market more competitive by opening it up to international competition. I think that was the other thing I was thinking of. Oh, and if they are looking to liberalize markets, that suggests that they may actually be receptive to the Trump administration's entreaties to open up Indian markets, because that's one of the things the Trump administration has demanded in the negotiations over the trade agreement that they've been working on with India. And the Indian government has traditionally been very, very resistant to doing that, but the agreement with the UK suggests that they may actually be open to doing that. Let's see. The UK gave up fewer concessions. Like I mentioned earlier, they didn't lower their tariffs by all that much in absolute terms. 0 is notable, but lowering it to 0 from like 3, that's not that big. So India definitely giving away more here. And I cite that as further evidence that the Indian government is interested in trade liberalization, because otherwise this agreement is relatively one-sided in favor of Britain. Let's see, some other implications here. So if the Indian manufacturing market is not opened up to other trade partners, like I think it will be, then the British will have a significant advantage, because everybody else is still going to get the 100% tariff on cars, and British automakers are going to get much lower tariffs, the 10% tariffs. That might mean that the UK just ends up being an input for re-exports. In other words, everybody just sends the cars they want to export into India through Britain instead. So Britain not necessarily benefiting that much in that case, but it may be that in so much as there are British car manufacturers left at this point, they will have a significant advantage. For now, anyway. In general, I don't think British exports to India will surge that much. British manufacturing will have something of an edge here because they're going to get lower tariffs, but the issue is that the British manufacturing sector is relatively small in absolute terms at this point. British automotive market, the electrical machinery market, these are not really global heavy hitters. They kind of specialize more at the higher end. So while they could generate significantly more revenue, I don't think there's going to be significantly more production or in turn significantly more jobs that come out of this. Also, medical devices was another item listed. That's just an inherently small industry. Let's see. Also consider Japanese car makers already dominate the Indian market for cars, so it's already kind of saturated. There's not necessarily a lot of growth potential there.
We talked about that recently and why.
Yeah. And there's going to be a mild export bump. This is a benefit. One of the things Britain could benefit from is a mild export bump that could help manufacturers' finances. So in so much as British manufacturers have been having trouble finding sales, growth, etc., this could help them in that regard. So they could be more financially healthy, which would definitely be beneficial. That would certainly grant their employees more job security. But I expect that to only really happen at the margin. I don't think this is necessarily going to augur an explosion in firms in Britain that are mostly dependent on exports to India. I'm skeptical that's going to be in the cards on this. The British aerospace industry could benefit the most. One of the things they're going to benefit from is government procurement loosening. So generally, countries prefer to procure defense equipment from domestic producers. If the Indians are going to agree to allow British aerospace companies to compete for more contracts in the defense space in India, they could potentially pick up significant market share. since British companies in that particular area are very, very competitive. British finance might benefit. They always do, no surprise. Depending again on procurement liberalization, the Indian government runs, as you might guess, lots of pension programs, insurance programs, and they have to put that money somewhere. So it could be that they decide to allow some British financial firms to handle some of that money, which would, of course, be a big boon for those companies. Let's see, I already talked about re-export. The effect on inflation should be deflationary, hypothetically. So there should be mildly lower prices overall for British and Indian consumers that stem from this. Although, again, I have to add, the British economy is not like a huge economy anymore. So India signing a free trade agreement with them is not necessarily going to be as deflationary as signing an agreement with a much larger trading partner. So deflationary effect overall in aggregate, but overall scale will be relatively modest. So yeah, definitely a win for the British government, since that's something they've been working on for a long time across multiple administrations. But I don't think the benefits are going to be that great to them, even though the Indians did end up giving more concessions. But like I said, I think India did that for their own reasons. I think they're kind of shifting in that direction. I would point out that the Modi government has always wanted to liberalize India's economy. But whenever they've tried, they've invariably encountered significant political opposition from within Indian politics. There's lots of actors within India's political economy that prefer a more regulated economy because they very frequently get special privileges and subsidies and whatnot in the existing status quo that they would lose if the economy were liberalized. So if the Modi administration can use this as an excuse to introduce some liberalization and competitiveness in India's economy, I think they're going to jump at that. And I think it could be that the Trump administration putting pressure on them might be an excuse to do that. You know, it may be a tool of leverage that Modi can use against his rivals within India's political system to try to get this kind of liberalization passed where previously it would have been too toxic. So some interesting develops for India politically, but otherwise economically, I don't think that the deal is going to amount to a whole lot. It's pretty bare bones, relatively speaking. It doesn't really address the services sector for the most part, other than government procurement. And, you know, both India and Britain are mostly services economies, so that is an important item. It's not going to save anybody's manufacturing sector, even though it does open up some opportunities. Doesn't really seem to do a whole lot for food, although I think I did know that whiskey benefited. Oh, actually, no, that was the U.S. agreement. We'll talk about the U.S. agreement next. I think that's worth getting into. But yeah, overall, a modest trade agreement that augurs potentially much bigger changes within India's trade policy. That's my overall reading of that.
Cool.
Yeah, the other trade agreement the UK finalized was with the Trump administration. So there is a nominal US-UK trade agreement in place, but it's very bare bones. It's not nearly as substantive as the India agreement, for example. And that agreement itself was not all that substantive. Yeah, mostly it was just a framework that was agreed with the Trump administration, nothing concrete yet. We'll see where it goes. Let's see, to find it first. Nope, that's Ukraine. It's lost in my notes somewhere. Well, the gist of it is just that the reciprocal tariffs that the United States was going to impose will not be imposed. There is still going to be a 10% baseline in place. That's not going to change. It seems like the Trump administration is hell-bent on making sure that there's at least 10% tariffs in place regardless of negotiations. But anything higher than that, as had been planned, as had been announced, that's no longer in the cards. And I think the agreement also included a temporary reprieve for British automakers. I think they're getting a waiver on the car tariffs that the Trump administration imposed. Presumably the 10% tariff will still apply, even in that case. But the 25% automotive tariffs, those no longer seem to be in place for the UK as per the agreement. The British concession to get all that stuff was basically just to agree to a series of quotas. So Britain will have basically duty-free access to the US market. Well, sorry, other way around. Certain US categories of goods will have duty-free access to the UK up to a certain amount, up to a certain quota. I think beef was one. I think automotive was another one. Again, I don't have the notes in front of me, so I'm not sure about all of the categories. Beef in particular was a notable one because American governments for decades have been trying to get more access to European markets for American beef producers. So it is a substantive concession for the UK to agree to that. However, the caveat there is that the British government has not agreed to change its regulations on beef. So the UK, like much of the rest of Europe, in fact, I think the entirety of the rest of Europe, has restrictions on hormone-treated beef. One of the ways you can try to ensure that your beef is bigger, better, whatever, you can treat your cows with hormones, and that'll make them grow fatter, basically. That's my understanding. Chat, please correct me if I'm getting the details on that wrong. But in Europe, you can't do that. They don't really trust the science behind that. And so you can't sell that. And that, of course, is a major barrier to entry into the market there for beef producers in the United States, because almost all of them do treat their beef with hormones, just to one degree or another. So while they do now have duty-free access to the UK market up to a certain point, the regulations in place in the UK are going to prevent them from exporting pretty much anything. So unless you're one of the few beef producers in the United States that does not treat your beef with hormones, you're not going to benefit from this trade agreement that much, contrary to what I'm sure the Trump administration has been trumpeting. Oh, here we go. Let's see. So the quota for cars is 100,000. So both British and American producers can export into the counterparty an amount of cars up to 100,000 before duties are applied. And I think they extended that to car parts and apparently plane parts. Let's see. Beef quota, 13,000 metric tons. That's what it is. So American beef producers will be able to export up to 13,000 metric tons of beef into the UK before tariffs are applied. Although, again, that's probably not going to happen for the aforementioned reasons. Let's see. The British also dropped tariffs on American ethanol from 19% to 0%. I don't think Britain has much of an ethanol industry, so I'm not even sure why they had tariffs up on that in the first place. Regardless, that should make it cheaper in the UK.
They have promised more expensive in Europe than it is in the US.
What was that?
Fuel is way more expensive in Europe than it is in the US.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know that ethanol is necessarily going to help too much with that. But in so much as it does, maybe lower fuel prices a little bit. One of the things the UK and the US did agree to do is to continue talks in the future in which they would return to the regulatory issue, especially regarding hormone-treated beef. They also said that they would return to the issue of poultry treated with chlorine. Chlorinated chicken is an issue that's propped up repeatedly in the Anglo-American trading relationship over the past couple decades. That's another example of a practice common in the US that's banned in the UK and Europe. See, I think I pretty much covered the rest of it already. So like I mentioned before, this is not a trade agreement per se. This is actually just a framework for an agreement. They're actually going to continue negotiating all the details in the months to come. And I would note personally that the history of these kinds of trade agreements framework agreements, so to speak, negotiated by the Trump administration, is that they frequently end up being permanently delayed, quote unquote, or they're eventually in their final form passed, but in a significantly scaled down form. So it may be that whatever agreement is actually finalized here bears very little resemblance to what has been negotiated here thus far. The administration is touting this as a case study in what it wants with other countries, which, if true, pretty much confirms our theory that the administration's trade policy objectives are mostly just superficial bullshit agreements that it can tout as achievements in the media, not really substantive trade agreements per se. We'll see where that goes, but more and more evidence now that that is the case. Also, as a final note here, well, I have some other stuff, but that's just statistics. Just a final note here, the legality of this agreement is highly suspect. The administration's whole logic for unilaterally setting tariffs and whatnot has been powers under the Economic Emergency Powers Act, which allows an administration to unilaterally negotiate and set tariffs. However, it's kind of hard to justify that here because this agreement doesn't mention national security at all. It doesn't really even touch on areas relevant to national security. So the administration is abusing its power under the Emergency Economic Powers Act more and more, the more it pretenses to have the power to unilaterally negotiate tariff agreements. Setting tariffs is one thing. The legal grounds for doing that is stronger. But the Economic Emergency Powers Act, there's nothing in there that allows the government to negotiate a tariff agreement. That's different. That is a power exclusively reserved for Congress. So while there is an agreement in principle here that has resulted in a lowering of American tariffs on British goods, this may not survive scrutiny in court. And it may not be unusual in that regard if there are other agreements like this that are in the pipeline. So keep your eye on that as well. The administration is pretending to have achieved something, but the final agreement has not been made, and it could be that the courts end up scuppering the whole thing. So some trivia here about the trading relationship. The U.S. exported just under $2.2 billion in agricultural products to the U.K. last year. That's 2024, with ethanol being the single highest selling product, which surprised me. I would have thought it would just be food, but I guess not. Even more interesting, the U.S. imported from the U.K. $2.7 billion in agricultural products, which means the U.S. actually has an agricultural deficit with the U.K. Now, that really surprised me, because I would have thought that the U.S. as a major agricultural exporter would have surely had a surplus with the U.K., but apparently not. Now, the reason for this will make this make much more sense. The lion's share of the UK's total exports, agricultural exports to the United States, are distilled spirits, such as Scotch and gin, which themselves comprise $1.6 billion of that $2.7 billion it exports to the US every year. So while the US does have a agricultural deficit, so to speak, with the UK, it's not in terms of food or other things that the US is strong in. It's mostly just because the UK is exporting a lot of whiskey and other alcoholic beverages to the United States. And those, mind you, are more valuable, in terms of weight and quantity than, commodities like corn, wheat, what have you. The United States exports a lot in absolute terms, in terms of weight, wheat, whatnot, to places like the UK, Europe. But the value of that is relatively small because food is very cheap, historically speaking right now. Alcoholic beverages, by contrast, they can get more of a premium. And so even if you're not necessarily exporting a whole lot of them in quantity, the value tends to kind of crowd out the value of other items in the agricultural category. So basically, we feed the UK, and in exchange, the UK gets us drunk. Thank you, UK. Much appreciated.
Do you ever drink alcohol?
Nope.
That's fair.
I think the most alcohol I ever drank was when I was in China and was kind of socially obligated to. I didn't really want to just say no. I wasn't sure if they would really even understand the idea of not drinking alcohol. So I just figured I'd be a diplomat and drink a little bit while we were out and about.
Did you get fucked up?
No, I didn't drink that much.
Okay.
I think I ended up giving most of mine to my sister.
Valid.
Well, how are we doing on time?
Oh, we're at 2 hours 20. As usual, we don't have to do the full hours if we're light on material and so on.
Gotcha. Well, we're not light on material, but I don't know how much we want or can get to. Was there any particular item you wanted to touch on here?
What are the options?
Well, we still got Ukraine, but I would point out there hasn't really been a whole lot of developments there.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff has happened, but nothing concrete. You know how it is with the Trump administration.
Yeah.
We've still got the Iran Wikipedia dive we could talk a little bit about.
What is that?
I just delved into the history of Iran because I didn't know a whole lot about it. So I had some notes on the geography I thought might be of interest. Sure. Beyond that, I just had a bunch of stuff on trade, the Trump administration's trade negotiations and policy. I think those are the main categories. There's some other regional stuff, some stuff about Sudan and DR Congo. I think we already talked about the elections in Australia and Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Already got Europe. Yeah, we've covered a lot of it, actually.
People are saying there's a discussion about a 30-day ceasefire. I have no idea what the odds of that going through are.
Pretty slim. Yeah, that was the most recent development. Russia says that it's willing to have direct talks with the Ukrainians in Istanbul. But the Ukrainians and the Europeans are demanding a 30-day ceasefire first. And the Europeans have threatened that if Russia doesn't agree to a 30-day ceasefire by tomorrow, Monday, then there's going to be quote-unquote massive sanctions, presumably more massive than the ones they already have on. I don't know how that's going to work exactly, but that's the threat anyway. The Trump administration, for its part, has come out and pressured the Ukrainian government to agree to direct talks. Not clear if they'll accept. Probably, I would guess Kyiv will accept and will participate in the talks, especially given American leverage. But I don't think anybody has any expectations at all as far as the Russian position. Presumably, they're just going to come in and make the same demands they've always made. Yeah, one of the things I've read from analysts is that neither Kiev nor Moscow wants to be seen as being responsible for stonewalling the peace negotiations, but neither one really wants to give significant concessions either. Mm-hmm. So the result is that both of them are kind of playing games, pretending to go along with the Trump administration's preference for peace talks, while at the same time blaming each other for scuppering them. I would point out that Russia probably is more responsible, just given that their demands are largely just that Ukraine capitulate, which of course the Ukrainian government isn't interested in doing. So we'll see if the 30-day ceasefire happens. My guess is that it won't, and that the peace talks in Istanbul will proceed and that nothing of substance will result from them.
I see. Posturing.
Yeah, always lots of that in diplomacy. So Ukraine, Iran, trade. Those are your main options left.
Let's do Iran.
Okay. Yeah, history, haven't been doing a whole lot of history stuff, so I was particularly interested in Iran the past couple weeks. Yeah, so how do you think about Iran's geography, Neuro? How much do you know about it?
Well, it was once known as Persia, correct?
Correct.
It's got some key river systems that cause it to be a kind of an empire for a while. And I think
it does not.
It doesn't?
No, there's no major rivers in Iran.
Oh.
At least nothing on the scale of like the Rhine River, the Mississippi, the Volga, etc.
Where are the Tigris and the Euphrates?
That's Iraq.
Oh, shit. Okay, tell me about Iran.
Mixing them up, huh? Yeah. Understandable. Yeah, the other I country in the Middle East, Iran. Yeah, it used to be called Persia, but the geography is what I was specifically interested in because I didn't really have a firm grasp of geography in Iran. You know, whenever I looked at it at a map, it just seemed like really mountainous, rugged territory. So I didn't have a clear idea of why certain parts of the country were more densely populated than other parts, since they all kind of looked similar to me. I didn't have a firm grasp of the political geography of Iran and the history thereof. So I didn't really understand what the major poles of civilization and urbanization were. So that's kind of what I looked into, and I was able to kind of glean that to a degree. I'm still kind of a neophyte, but maybe other people who don't know anything about Iranian geography may find this of interest. So if you look at a population density map of Iran, what you'll find is that most of the population lives in the western half of the country. And the most densely populated parts of the map are kind of form a V shape. It's very distinctive. It runs along the southwestern border of the country, southeast to northwest, and then it reaches the northwest corner, and then it turns east along the northern part of the country. So that's where most of the population lives specifically. So what I had missed before, looking at the geography, was the significance of altitude, which is still relatively new to me. That's like something I kind of didn't pay much attention to until like 5 to 10 years ago. And what I mean by that is that if you live in a part of the world that's very hot, like close to the equator, you can actually get away from the heat by going to an area that has high altitude. Mm-hmm. It's pretty intuitive, but I had never really thought that there were enough places like that to allow for a civilization to really thrive. I would have thought that either you had a civilization pretty much needed a river basin. That was my bias. Mm-hmm. I was always looking for major rivers, kind of like what you just said, like it had a major river. Iran doesn't have that, so it particularly confused me. So what it does have is relatively high elevation. So even though it's in a very hot part of the world, the Iranian plateau, and especially certain parts of the Iranian plateau, are sufficiently high altitude that the climate in particular places is actually relatively moderate. And that actually allowed more traditional forms of agriculture and animal husbandry that would be more familiar to Europeans and European descended people like me than some of the other types of activity that you would see in that part of the world. And it's specifically in those areas with a climate and with terrain similar to places like Greece and Italy, where civilization seems to have particularly cropped up and thrived in Iran. And so specifically, that western border region along the border with Iraq that runs roughly southeast, southwest, that dark part of the population density map, what you'll find is that that's where the Zagros mountain range runs. It runs almost exactly parallel to the border. And while some parts of it, especially in the middle, are very rugged, relatively high, relatively jagged to the point where you can't really settle there, some of those areas are inhospitable, but most of it is actually relatively mild. That is to say, it's high altitude, but it's not rugged. There's actually significant parts of the Zagros Mountains where there's big valleys, plains, basically flat terrain where you can engage in traditional agriculture. And in the parts that are maybe not flat enough for traditional agriculture, it's hilly enough, not jagged mountains, but just hilly enough for things like herds of lamb, goats, stuff like that. So it's specifically in those areas where you see traditional Persian civilization really originate and flower. Much to my surprise, like the part of Persia that the Persian civilization originated from was actually the Persian province of Fars, which I had no idea. Like, it was totally counterintuitive to me because that's in the southeastern part of the Zagros Mountains. And it's relatively close to the eastern part of Iran, which is mostly empty. It's too dry for agriculture. Parts of it are just too cold or too hot. It's very barren. It's very inhospitable. But Fars is in a part of the Zagros Mountains that's high enough to make the climate mild for agriculture, but not so high as to be too cold or to have jagged mountains where people can't really live or farm or herd sheep and whatnot. It's kind of in a Goldilocks zone in that regard. And it's relatively deep in the south of Iran, too. So that Fars region, that's where Persian civilization mostly originated from, and it kind of spread out from there. That's where famous cities like Persepolis were I think there was another one, Parthia, something like that. Both of those are located in Fars, for example. And, looking at the Zagros Mountains, it kind of reminded me, once I looked at it long enough, of Italy. So if you look at Italy, it's a long mountain chain, north-south, and it's got some coastal regions that are kind of lowland and flat that allow for agriculture, and a lot of hills for animal husbandry, and then some jagged mountains kind of in between. It's all sort of mangled all together into a weird tapestry. And on either side of the Italian peninsula is sort of inhospitable ocean of one kind or another. Now, despite the fact that the terrain is really rugged, obviously Italy hosted civilization, right? People, even with the relatively small areas of fertile land, flat land, they were able to make that work. That was kind of easier to do in the ancient world. Now you kind of need more. But back then, a relatively modestly sized plain would be sufficient for a major city-state that could then cultivate advanced culture of one kind or another, and then form the basis for an advanced civilization. So if you look at the Zagros Mountains, it kind of resembles Italy. This is a rough analogy that I'm going to make. And I know there's lots of differences, but my sort of European brain understands it better this way, so bear with me. So the Zagros Mountains, kind of like Italy, are in a long, elongated sort of mountain chain that is interspersed with flat plains and hills. And the principal difference, I would say, is one, it's not, it doesn't have seas on either side of it like Italy does, but it does have something similar, which is desert. It has open desert to the east and west. The Tigris and Euphrates obviously are there. I think there's like one or two tributaries that run from the Zagros to Mesopotamia, but otherwise it's pretty barren. There's not a lot there. So kind of like Italy, it's just sort of this thin, elongated stretch of territory that is sort of eligible for the support of a civilization. And if you look at what civilizations have emerged there, not just Persian, you can see how they're focused on the Zagros Mountains. Like the Persians were one in the south, in Fars province. And then to the northwest of them is a part of the Zagros Mountains that are very rugged and didn't really host much. But then they kind of get mellower to the northwest of that, and that's where you see the ancient kingdom of Medea emerge. And they were a similar civilization to the Persians. They were all kind of descended from the same Persian Indo-European ancestors, but the Medeans were slightly different, kind of different dialect, somewhat different culture. And the Medeans emerged also in the Zagros Mountains, again illustrating that this part of the world can kind of host that. It has the agricultural capacity for that, kind of like, again, Italy, my example. And then to the northwest of that, you get the Kurds and then the Azeris, two other peoples. I don't think they urbanized as much as the Medeans or the Persians did, but they also built their own little kingdoms and civilizations up there. So I think the principal difference with Italy is altitude, because with Italy, it was the coastal lowlands, which were very low altitude, that hosted most of the urbanization and cultural development. In the Zagros Mountains, by contrast, low altitude meant too hot. Like the climate just would have been inhospitable for traditional agriculture. So you had to climb a little higher. But once you did, you ended up with terrain and climate that was actually pretty similar to the Mediterranean climate in and around Greece and Italy.
Is that so similar to like Chile and South America? Like I don't know if they're called the Incans.
Yeah, the Incans. No, very different from the Incans.
Okay.
Because the thing about Incan civilization is that it actually did emerge in jagged mountains. Like the Andes Mountains are a relatively new, young mountain chain, and so they're much, much more rugged. The Incans were able to emerge because there were a few isolated valleys in the Andean mountain chain that they were able to cultivate. And also, they were able to learn how to cultivate, I think, wheat and corn using terraced farming, which allowed them to farm along the sides of hills that were even very steep, sometimes even mountains.
Gotcha. But the Zagros are not so steep and treacherous.
Yeah. Yeah, the Zagros are much, much more mild in that regard. Oh. It's kind of like the difference between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachians.
Yeah.
Right, the Rocky Mountains are much taller, much more jagged, much harder to traverse, whereas the Appalachians, they're almost more like big giant hills. It's more rolling, more gentle, much lower in altitude, etc. So that's kind of the difference between the Andes and the Zagros in that regard.
Gotcha. I did pull up the map here so I can see the Elburz Mountains that are in the far north of the country. The Zagros are kind of going diagonally down the middle from northwest to southeast. And then you've got the Lut Desert that's in the east. And then it looks like a lowlands kind of in the south. And you said there's a V shape that has the majority of the population?
Yeah, if you look up Iran population density map, you'll be able to see it very clearly. Yeah, there is a lowland region to the southwest of the Zagros Mountains, which connects to the Mesopotamian plain. I can't remember the name of the river, but it actually hosted an ancient city called Susa, and it was more part of the Mesopotamian civilization cluster, Babylon, those sort of city-states. So Susa, I don't think, was ever Semitic like the other Mesopotamian city-states were. I think it was kind of more Persian. I think it was originally called the Elamite Kingdom. But the Persians did expand into it, and it became an integral part of Persia for basically millennia, and it remains part of Iran to this day. Yeah, you can kind of roughly see it there.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah, so the top of the V, the one that runs along the top of the country, that's the coastal region adjacent to the Caspian Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And the land there is very, very green, very fertile. I think it would be very familiar to most people in Western Europe, which are kind of used to more rolling flat plains. Mm-hmm. So the terrain there is more like that, rather than sort of the hilly Mediterranean-style terrain in the Zagros Mountains. So there's much more agriculture there, and correspondingly, a lot more people live there. One of the interesting things I found, while I was kind of reading about this, is that this region here, this coastal strip here, to the north of that mountain chain that runs east-west, it's called Mazarandon, by the way. It's never really hosted a capital of Iran. It's never really been an important political center or civilizational center for the various Persian empires that have ruled this region. Instead, a lot more of the capitals have actually been to the south of that east-west mountain chain there, the Elburz Mountains. Mm. And the reason there is because of the Silk Road. The Silk Road ran from Central Asia into northeastern Iran, and then ran west to the south of the Elburz Mountains, and then west into the Armenian highlands in the northwestern part of Iran. And most of the capitals of various Persian empires have actually been located along that trading route, rather than the coastal lowlands or even in the Zagros Mountains.
It's just the most navigable by land is why?
Basically, yeah. I mean, if you're going to carry goods by foot, then yeah, that would be the best way to do it. That traditional trade route was formed specifically because of that reason. Mm-hmm. But also, the trade route was more prosperous. Like traditionally, an agriculturally productive region would be the main tax base for an empire. But if you have a major lucrative trade route that runs through your empire, the cities that emerge along that trade route are probably going to generate a lot more revenue, because those cities are going to have a lot of merchants that are very cash rich that you can tax. And they're probably going to be a lot more cash rich than the sort of feudal peasants that are working the land in an agriculturally rich region. So as a result, the political economy of ancient Persia actually gravitated geographically closer to the Silk Road rather than to the more agriculturally productive regions of Persia.
Interesting. Would they choose a defensible location, like somewhat mountainous? Or would that
I mean, the whole thing is mountainous, really. The whole Iranian plateau is pretty well defended. In fact, if you look at a topographical map of Iran, you can see that Iran's borders are almost all mountains of one kind or another. Mm. So the Zagros Mountains in the west, the Armenian highlands in the northwest, the Elburz Mountains in the north, and then there's another mountain chain in the east. I don't remember what its name is, but it runs along most of the border with Pakistan and Afghanistan. So the natural defenses of Iran are actually quite strong in that regard.
Gotcha, yeah.
So even just having a capital anywhere in the interior of Iran means you're pretty well protected overall.
Yeah, Tehran here is south of the Elburz Mountains and north of the Zagros Mountains.
Historically, Tehran was called Ray, and it was a major node on the Silk Route. That's why it became important.
Gotcha.
That confused the shit out of me for the longest time. I could not understand why Tehran was the capital of Iran, because it didn't seem to be like in a really fertile region, like I would normally expect a capital to be in. But then it turns out it's just because it was on the Silk Road. It was just a major trading city.
That's cool. I didn't
Actually,
know any of
Tehran
this.
in particular was important because the Silk Road ran west into Tehran, and then it split. Tehran was actually the site of a crossroads in the Silk Road, where it diverged, with one branch going northwest into the Armenian highlands, and then another branch going southwest into the Zagros Mountains, and then into Mesopotamia, eventually terminating in Baghdad.
Cool. See if I can find a Silk Road map. It's not going to give me drug stuff, is it?
As long as you stay away from Tor, I think you should be okay.
Okay. All right, we got a map. To Anatolia, so this is still pretty far to the east, but it has Beijing and Shanghai as the two kind of endpoints easternmost. There's the Imperial Highway going through the mountains and so on. Himalayas, so it kind of goes around them and then down toward India to the Bay of Bengal. And then there are a couple splits here. You've got a north option and a south option a couple places. Bukhara, there's the Aral Sea. Yeah, that doesn't go all the way. Let's see if we can find a better one. Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
This one goes all the way to Arabia. Much better. Aha. This one goes to Constantinople. Wow. Into Gaza. Sweet. Persia. Oh, there's Ray. So this is Tehran in the Caspian Sea. So we saw that before. Antioch. So that would be in starts with an A.
Syria.
Oh, Syria.
Yeah, present day Syria. I believe. I could be wrong.
It would take a long ass time if you're going from a part of China to all the way. I would guess most traders aren't like doing the full lap. You're kind of figuring out what your
you do
route is.
legs.
Yeah.
You know, you might have one guy who specializes in going from China to Central Asia, and then another guy living in Central Asia that specialized going from Central Asia further west, and then so forth.
That's way smarter.
Yeah, you'd have to be very adventurous to want to do the whole thing. That's what Marco Polo did.
Yeah, that would take years.
And he did it on purpose, just because he wanted to explore. Yeah, I also did some reading on the geography of the Armenian highlands, which is partly in northwestern Iran, and that's also pretty interesting. Maybe next time we can talk about that.
Nice.
That constitutes the border region, or at least most of the border region, between the traditional Ottoman Empire and the traditional Persian empires of one kind or another. And I'd always known that they'd kind of fought each other when they fought wars in the Armenian highlands, but because the geography was so alien to me, it all just looked very mountainous, generically mountainous. I had no idea like why battles were fought in which area or what the geographic strategic choke points were or any of that. It was all Greek to me. So I finally sat down the past couple of weeks and just studied the Armenian highlands, and I've got a grasp of it. You know, nowhere near being an expert, but I've got a foothold in the Armenian highlands, so we could talk about that, and that could be fun.
I like that. I feel like geography is one of the things that shapes empires, just because it creates defensible locations, it creates hubs of resources, it lays out the trade routes. It's the map that we're playing on for humanity. So you can definitely see the success and failure and just prosperity of different entities as being very much related to the shape of the ground and the water, and as you mentioned here, the altitude. Because you don't usually think of Iran as being a fertile place, but like you're saying, if it's hot in the low ground, but they have plenty of high ground and it's cooler up there, then it might be ideal conditions for certain types of farming and shepherding and stuff like that. Because Persia was massive and powerful, and you do need a decent bit of just food production to be able to support a big population.
Yeah, and they had it. Just not in the places you might expect if you're European.
Well, cool. We're at a reasonable ramp-up point. Do you have any interest in playing some HOTS this evening?
Oh, sure. Sounds fun.
Well, cool. Well, thank you, chat, for tuning in, and thank you, Agent Smith, for your expertise. And we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.